The frozen ground cracked beneath boots as the young man stumbled backward through the December darkness, his expensive parka torn open at the collar, his breath coming in panicked gasps that crystallized instantly in the 40 below air. Behind him, the assembled villagers of Kivalina stood silent as stone monuments, their faces illuminated by the flames of oil lamps and the aurora that writhed green and purple across the Arctic sky, their eyes reflecting something harder than the permafrost beneath their feet. The son of the territory's wealthiest mining executive had always believed his father's money could buy him out of any situation, that his last name carried enough weight to crush anyone who dared challenge him. But as he backed toward the edge of the village, where the tundra stretched endless and unforgiving into the night, he understood with absolute clarity that there were places his privilege could not reach, and he had finally found one, his fingers already starting to stiffen from the cold because someone had taken his gloves, fumbled uselessly at his torn coat. And in that moment, he remembered the young teacher he had terrorized for months, the woman he had thought weak because she spoke softly and carried books instead of rifles, and he realized with the kind of terror that stops the heart that she had been the strongest person in the village all along. But what these arrogant bullies didn't know, what they could never understand from inside their bubbles of inherited wealth and unearned authority, was that true power doesn't announce itself with violence and threats, but builds itself quietly through honor, through kindness, through the respect earned by treating others with dignity, even when they show you none. Subscribe now to witness how justice finds its way, even to the most remote corners of the world, where the systems that usually protect the privileged break down like machinery in the Arctic cold, and where a community remembers what it means to protect their own. But let's rewind to where it all began. To a September morning, when the first teacher most of these families had seen in 5 years stepped off the weekly mail plane onto the gravel airstrip, with nothing but 2 suitcases, a box of books, and a determination born from watching her own mother clean houses for families who treated her like furniture. Sarah Morrison was 28 years old and had exactly $417 in her savings account when she accepted the teaching position in Kivalina, a village of 240 souls perched on the edge of the Chukchi Sea, where the Brooks Range met the Arctic Ocean in a collision of mountains and ice. She had grown up in the mining camps of West Virginia, daughter of a coal miner who died of black lung when she was 15, and a mother who took in laundry and cleaned the company houses to keep food on the table, and she had clawed her way through community college, on scholarships and night shifts at the diner, earned her teaching certificate through correspondence courses, while working as a secretary, saved every penny for 3 years to attend the summer intensive at the University of Alaska. The other teachers in that program had come from solid middle-class families, with father who were doctors and lawyers, families who could afford to send their daughters north for an adventure. But Sarah had come because she understood what it meant to be invisible to the people with power, and she knew that the Inupiat children in Alaska's most remote villages were invisible to almost everyone. On her last night in Fairbanks before flying north, the program director had pulled her aside, with genuine concern creasing his weathered face, and told her that Kivalina was different from the other villages, that the territorial government had granted mining rights to a massive copper deposit 15 miles inland, that the company had brought in outside workers who treated the place like a frontier outpost, that there had been trouble. Sarah had smiled the same smile she'd given the mine bosses' wives back home when they'd complained about how their maids folded the towels, had thanked him for his concern, and had boarded the plane the next morning with her jaw set and her notebooks organized. The village itself was a collection of rough plywood houses and traditional sod-roofed dwellings arranged along a single gravel road that ran parallel to the beach, where racks of drying salmon stood like wooden forests, and overturned umiaks rested on driftwood logs waiting for spring. The school was a one-room building painted optimistic yellow that had faded to the color of old teeth, with a barrel stove that Sarah learned to feed constantly through the long winter nights when she stayed late grading papers, and windows that faced north toward the frozen sea where the pack ice ground against itself with sounds like distant thunder. Her housing was a 10 by 12 foot addition built onto the back of the schoolhouse, with a cot, a hot plate, a shelf for books, and a chemical toilet that had to be emptied weekly into the village's waste pit. The first thing she did after unpacking was write a letter to her mother describing the northern lights. how they moved like living creatures across the sky, how the stars were so bright they cast shadows, how she could hear the ice singing at night when the temperature dropped and the sea froze solid. The second thing she did was visit every family in the village, walking door to door through the September mud with a notebook and genuine questions about their children, their lives, their hopes for education, and by the end of her first month, she knew every child's name, every family's history, which students needed eyeglasses they couldn't afford, which ones came to school hungry because the hunting had been poor, which ones had gifts for mathematics or art or storytelling that had gone unrecognized by the string of temporary teachers who had cycled through before her. Among those families was the Anagic household, where 63-year-old David Anagic lived with his wife Mary and their grandson Tommy. David had served in the Aleutian campaign during the war, had fought Japanese soldiers in conditions that made the Arctic winter look gentle, and had returned home to find that his service meant nothing to the territorial government that still treated Native Alaskans as second-class citizens. He was a man of few words, who carved intricate ivory figures during the dark months, who could read weather in the behavior of seabirds, who knew the migration patterns of caribou going back 40 years, and who watched Sarah with careful eyes those first weeks, measuring her against the parade of outsiders who had promised much and delivered little. It was Tommy who broke the ice, literally, when he fell through rotten ice near the shore during recess, and Sarah went in after him without hesitation, emerging soaked and shaking, and laughing to reassure the terrified 9-year-old that everything was fine, even as hypothermia started to creep through her bones. David had been the one who pulled them both out, had carried Sarah to his house, had ordered Mary to get her into dry clothes, while he made tea so strong it could strip paint, and when Sarah's teeth finally stopped chattering enough for her to speak, she had apologized for being careless, for not recognizing the danger, for putting Tommy at risk. David had studied her for a long moment, then had nodded once, slowly, and from that day forward, she had an ally, though she wouldn't understand the full significance of that alliance until much later. The trouble started in mid-October, when the company helicopter began making weekly runs to the village, bringing supplies and rotating crews from the mine, and bringing the mine superintendent's son, who treated the entire territory like his personal playground. His name was Preston Fairchild III, 24 years old, Princeton education interrupted by disciplinary issues that his family's donations had temporarily smoothed over. Son of a man who owned 3 mines in Alaska and had enough influence in the territorial legislature to get laws written to his specifications, Preston had pale blue eyes, the color of winter sky, and blonde hair he kept immaculately groomed, even in the field, wore custom-made expedition gear that cost more than most villagers earned in a year, and carried himself with the casual arrogance of someone who had never faced a meaningful consequence. He had been sent north by his father as punishment for some unspecified incident in Anchorage, assigned to work as a liaison between the mining operation and the village, a job that mostly involved driving a company truck between the mine and Kivalina and pretending to take notes during meetings. His first words to Sarah, spoken in front of her entire class on a Tuesday morning when he had barged into the schoolhouse without knocking, were, "So you're the new teacher, not bad looking for someone willing to bury herself in the middle of nowhere. When you get tired of playing pioneer woman, I'll show you how we have fun up here." The children had gone silent, their eyes dropping to their desks, and Sarah had felt something cold and separate from the Arctic wind settle into her spine as she recognized the particular species of predator that wore expensive clothes and friendly smiles. She had responded with professional courtesy that was colder than the permafrost, had thanked him for stopping by, and suggested that if he wanted to contribute to the children's education, he was welcome to return during designated visiting hours with advance notice, and had turned back to her lesson on Alaska geography with enough dismissal in her posture that even Preston couldn't misread it. But as he left, she had caught the look in his eyes, that particular combination of surprise and anger that comes when someone accustomed to automatic deference encounters resistance, and she had recognized it from the mine boss's sons back home, from every entitled young man who believed that women existed primarily for his entertainment and convenience. That evening, drinking tea at the Anagic house, where she had fallen into the habit of spending her evenings, learning Inupiaq words, and listening to stories about the old days before the territory became organized, David had asked her about the encounter in the casual way that made it clear someone had already told him every detail. When she downplayed it, not wanting to create drama, he had set down his carving knife and looked at her with the same intensity he had shown the day he pulled her from the water. That family, the Fairchilds, they think they own everything north of Anchorage, he had said carefully. Preston, he's been here 3 months. There's been trouble with some of the young women, things that would get a village man killed, but the company protects him. The territorial marshal is on the family payroll. So is the magistrate in Kotzebue. I tell you this not to frighten you, but so you know the ground you're standing on. Sarah had nodded, understanding what he wasn't saying directly, that this was information for her survival, that she was being warned because he had decided she was worth warning. The harassment began small, the way it always does, with actions designed to test boundaries and establish dominance while maintaining plausible deniability. Preston started showing up at the school regularly, always with some thin excuse about coordinating with the village or checking on company business, but really just to interrupt lessons, to make comments about Sarah's appearance or teaching methods, to undermine her authority in front of the children. He would lean against the doorframe in his $1,000 parka, smirking when she asked him to leave, making jokes about how she must be lonely out here, how it was unnatural for a woman to live alone, how she probably needed a real man to show her around. Sarah maintained her professional composure, documented every incident in a detailed log she kept locked in her desk, continued teaching with the same dedication that had brought her north in the first place. But the children noticed everything, the way children always do, and she could see them starting to tense when the helicopter approached, could feel their relief on weeks when Preston stayed at the mine. It was during this period that she started teaching them more than just reading and arithmetic, started incorporating lessons about dignity and self-respect, about the difference between power and cruelty, about how strength was measured not by how you treated those weaker than you, but by how you treated those you could hurt with impunity. November brought the darkness, the sun setting for the last time in early afternoon and not returning for weeks. And with the darkness came an escalation. Preston began driving through the village late at night, his truck's headlights sweeping across the schoolhouse windows, sometimes stopping outside for 30 minutes at a time with the engine running, just sitting there. Sarah would lie awake in her small room, listening to the idle of the diesel engine, understanding that this was meant to frighten her, to make her feel watched and vulnerable. She started sleeping in her clothes, kept a knife her mother had given her under her pillow, wrote letters home that she made deliberately cheerful so her mother wouldn't worry. During the day, she maintained her routine with iron discipline, up at 6 to start the barrel stove, teaching from 8 until 3, staying late to prepare lessons and help students who needed extra attention, eating dinner with village families who had adopted her into their meal rotations, spending evenings at the Anagik house or with the Kunuk family, whose daughter Lisa was her best student and wanted desperately to go to high school in Nome. It was Lisa's mother Ruth who finally told her what she needed to know, speaking in the matter-of-fact way that Alaska women used to discuss dangerous weather or aggressive wildlife, just practical information for survival. That Fairchild boy, he hurt 2 girls last year, one from Shishmaref and one who was working at the mine kitchen. Both times his father paid them off, gave their families money to stay quiet. The company moved the girls away, sent them to Anchorage with jobs and housing, and everyone was supposed to forget. But we don't forget. David and the other men, they talk about it, but what can they do? The territorial police won't come. The company controls everything. So we try to protect our daughters, keep them away from him, but a teacher living alone at the edge of the village, they worry about you too. December transformed the village into something from another world. The darkness complete except for the aurora and starlight, the cold so intense that breath froze into ice crystals that hung in the air. The only sounds the crack of contracting wood and the distant groan of pressure ridges forming in the sea ice. Sarah taught by lamplight, her students huddled around the barrel stove wrapped in caribou hide and wool, learning mathematics and reading, while outside the thermometer registered 45 below and falling. It was during this darkness that Preston made his first serious move, showing up at the school on a Friday afternoon when he knew all the children would be gone, drunk enough that she could smell the whiskey from across the room, dangerous enough that she felt her heart start hammering against her ribs. He had walked right in without knocking, had locked the door behind him with deliberate slowness, had smiled at her in a way that made her skin crawl. "I've been very patient with you," he had said, his words slightly slurred, but his intent perfectly clear. "Very respectful, but you're starting to hurt my feelings. Always so cold, always so professional. I think it's time we get to know each other better." Sarah had been grading papers at her desk, and she had continued marking homework with steady hands, even though everything in her was screaming to run. "Mr. Fairchild, you need to leave. This is inappropriate, and you know it. I'm asking you to go." He had laughed at that, actually laughed, and started walking toward her desk. "Who's going to stop me? The village elders? The territorial police who work for my father? You're out here all alone, sweetheart, and I think it's time you understood exactly how alone you are." What Preston didn't know, what his privilege and arrogance had blinded him to, was that Sarah Morrison had grown up in a coal camp where women learned to defend themselves or didn't survive, where her mother had taught her that being poor and female meant you had to be twice as smart and 3 times as tough, where she had learned to read danger in the shift of a man's weight and the glaze in his eyes. She had also spent her summer in Fairbanks training with a retired Marine who taught survival courses, not just wilderness survival, but the other kind, the kind that meant knowing where to hit and how hard and when to run. So when Preston reached for her, she didn't freeze and she didn't scream. She drove the pencil she'd been holding straight into the back of his hand with enough force to go clean through, pinning his palm to her desk, and in the half-second when shock paralyzed him, she was up and moving, had the fire poker from beside the stove in her hands, was standing between him and the door, with her feet planted and her eyes absolutely clear. "Get out," she said, and her voice didn't shake at all. "Pull that pencil out, wrap your hand, and get out of my school. If you ever touch me again, I'll kill you. Do you understand? Not hurt you, not report you, kill you. And in case you're wondering if I mean it, I watched my father die because the mine owners valued profit over safety. And I promised his grave that I would never let anyone push me around again." Preston had stared at her, blood dripping from his hand onto her wooden floor. And for the first time in his life, he had seen someone look at him not with fear, but with the absolute certainty that she would follow through on her threat. He had pulled the pencil out with a gasp, had wrapped his hand in his expensive silk neckerchief, and had left, but not before turning at the door to say, "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." That night, Sarah didn't sleep at all, sat up with the fire poker across her lap and her knife in her hand, listening to every sound in the darkness, waiting for retaliation that she knew would come. But what she hadn't counted on was that village networks move faster than company helicopters, and by morning, every adult in Kivalina knew exactly what had happened, though they couldn't have known because she hadn't told anyone. It was David who appeared at first light, letting himself into the schoolhouse without knocking, taking in the scene with one comprehensive glance. Sarah still sitting fully dressed beside the cold stove, the blood on the floor, the defensive weapons. He had started the fire without saying anything, had boiled water for tea, and only when he had pressed a cup into her hands did he speak. Mary's sister saw the light burning all night. In winter, people watch lights. We watch everything. It's how we survive. He had paused, drinking his own tea, choosing his words with the care of someone who understood that words could save lives or end them. Preston Fairchild left on the company plane this morning. His hand was bandaged. He looked angry. His father owns half the territory, controls the other half through money and connections. You understand what that means? Sarah had nodded, suddenly exhausted, feeling the weight of her isolation and vulnerability settling over her like pack ice. But David had continued, and his voice carried a different quality now, something hard, as obsidian, and twice as sharp. His father doesn't own this village. This is our land. Has been for 3,000 years. Will be for 3,000 more. The company has a lease for the mine, but they don't have a lease on our souls. You stood up to a predator. That matters. You protected yourself with courage and intelligence. That matters more. The village sees this. The village remembers. Do you understand what I'm telling you? What happened next would have been impossible to believe for anyone who didn't understand how remote communities survive, how information travels through networks built on kinship and mutual dependence, how people who have been marginalized by every official system learn to create their own justice when the authorities won't. Within a week of the incident, 3 things happened in rapid succession. First, a formal complaint was filed with the Territorial Education Board by every parent in Kivalina, praising Sarah's teaching and requesting her contract be extended. A document with 38 signatures that landed on desks in Juneau and couldn't be ignored. Second, the village council sent a letter to the mining company documenting Preston's behavior. Not just the attack on Sarah, but a careful accounting of 2 years of harassment, intimidation, and worse, names and dates and incidents recorded by people who had been told their testimony meant nothing, but had documented everything anyway. Third, and most significantly, David Anagik sent a letter to his former commanding officer from the Aleutian campaign, a man who had gone on to become a general, and who remembered, with crystal clarity, the native soldier who had saved his life on Attu Island by hearing Japanese troops through morning fog when everyone else heard nothing. The general made 3 phone calls to the territorial governor, to the commissioner of public safety, and to the board chairman of Fairchild Mining, and those 3 phone calls changed the entire situation because there were lines that even the wealthy and connected couldn't cross, and assaulting teachers in front of documented witnesses was apparently one of them. Preston Fairchild III was recalled to Anchorage in mid-December, officially for reassignment, but actually because his father had been given a choice between controlling his son or losing territorial mining contracts worth millions. The company issued a formal apology to the village, donated new textbooks to the school, and assigned a different liaison who was professional and distant and who treated Sarah with wary respect. But Sarah understood that this was only a pause, not a resolution, because men like Preston didn't accept being humiliated, especially not by women they considered beneath them, and because the systems that protected them were too entrenched to be dismantled by a few phone calls. She was right. The retaliation, when it came, was calculated and vicious, and designed to hurt her in ways that wouldn't leave physical evidence. In January, her supply order went missing. The boxes of books and paper and pencils that were supposed to arrive on the monthly mail plane simply vanished somewhere between Fairbanks and Kivalina, and when she filed a complaint, she was told there was no record of her order, despite having the receipts. Her paychecks started arriving late, then with deductions that weren't explained, then missing entirely for 6 weeks, while she survived on food given by village families who wouldn't let her go hungry. Official letters began arriving from the Territorial Education Office, questioning her teaching methods, her curriculum choices, her classroom discipline, all based on complaints filed by someone who never signed their name, but whose influence was obvious. Every letter required written responses, hours of documentation, proof of adherence to standards that were never clearly defined. A paper war designed to exhaust and discourage her. But what Preston and his father's lawyers didn't understand, what people born with money and power never quite grasp, is that poverty teaches persistence, that growing up with nothing makes you appreciate everything, that people who have fought for every scrap of dignity don't surrender just because the fight gets harder. Sarah responded to every letter with meticulous detail, documented every lesson plan with precision that would have impressed a military quartermaster, kept records of every interaction and every delivery and every dollar spent. She taught through the darkness with the same dedication she had shown in September, and her students bloomed under her attention, learning not just mathematics and reading, but something more valuable, that intelligence and dignity were more powerful than wealth, that courage meant standing up even when you were afraid, that justice was something you created through persistence, not something handed down by authorities. Lisa Kunuk, at 13, was reading at a high school level. Tommy Anagik had discovered a gift for mechanical drawing. Half a dozen other students who had been written off as slow learners by previous teachers were now performing at grade level. The village saw this, documented it in the same careful way they documented everything that mattered, and when the territorial education inspector finally arrived in March to evaluate Sarah's teaching, he found a classroom running with efficiency that would have impressed any school in Anchorage, and students who could not only recite their lessons, but could explain why education mattered, what it meant to them, how it was changing their futures. The inspector was a gray-haired man named Anderson, who had been teaching in Alaska for 30 years, and who had seen every scheme and fraud perpetrated by administrators and outside interests on village schools. He had come expecting to find justification for removing Sarah, had been told by officials in Juneau that she was troublesome and difficult and not suited for remote teaching. But what he found instead was something that stopped him cold. It was Tommy Anagik who did it, 10 years old now and unafraid, who had stood up during the inspection and said, "Miss Morrison is the first teacher who ever acted like we mattered. The others, they just waited until they could leave. She came here and stayed through the winter and taught us even when the company tried to make her quit, and my grandfather says that's the kind of teacher Alaska needs. Someone who understands that being poor and native doesn't mean being stupid." The other students had nodded, solemn as judges, and Anderson had felt something crack in his professional cynicism, had recognized that whatever political pressure had brought him here was aimed at the wrong target. His report, filed 2 weeks later, recommended not just extending Sarah's contract, but using her as a model for rural education programs throughout the territory, and included specific mention of the harassment campaign that had been waged against her and the educational outcomes she had achieved despite it. That report landed on desks where it couldn't be buried, was read by people who actually cared about education policy, and suddenly, Sarah Morrison was no longer an isolated teacher in a remote village, but a symbol of something larger, something about indigenous rights and educational access, and the kind of territory Alaska wanted to become. Preston Fairchild learned about the report in April, when the ice was starting to break up and the sun was climbing higher each day, and his rage was so intense that even his father couldn't control it. He had been drinking when he made his decision, had been drinking for months actually, his Princeton education abandoned, his future at the family company uncertain, his sense of invulnerability shattered by a woman half his size who had been willing to stab him with a pencil. He commandeered a company helicopter without authorization, flew north through deteriorating weather that should have grounded him, and landed on the Kivalina airstrip in the kind of blowing snow that made visibility 50 feet at best. No one saw him arrive because the entire village was inside during the whiteout, hunkered down the way you do when the Arctic decides to remind you of your insignificance. But his helicopter was there when the wind cleared, sitting on the runway like a metal insect, and Preston was in the village somewhere with his father's rifle and a head full of whiskey and grievance. David Anagik saw the helicopter first, recognized it from its company markings, understood immediately what it meant. He found Preston stumbling through the village toward the schoolhouse, could smell the alcohol from 10 feet away, could see the rifle slung across his shoulder. What would you have done in that moment, seeing a drunk man with a gun heading towards someone you had decided to protect, knowing that calling for help meant nothing because help was 6 hours away by plane if the weather cleared? David didn't hesitate, didn't call out a warning that might make Preston trigger happy, just moved with the silence he'd learned in the Aleutians and brought him down from behind with a tackle that should have ended things cleanly. But nothing ends cleanly when privilege collides with accountability, when years of unchecked behavior meet their first real obstacle, when a man who has never faced consequences suddenly faces all of them at once. Preston fought like someone who had never actually been in a fight before, wild and uncoordinated, and in the struggle, the rifle went off, the shot echoing across the village like thunder, bringing everyone running through the snow. The bullet went wide, hit nothing, but the sound was enough to wake the entire village, and within minutes, 20 men were there, including Ruth Kunuk's husband Peter, and Tommy's uncles, and half the hunting party that had just returned from the coast. They pulled David off Preston, not to protect Preston, but to protect David from doing something that would bring the full weight of territorial law down on him, because killing a white man in Alaska in 1963 was murder no matter the circumstances. But defending yourself from a drunk with a rifle was different, was defensible, was something that could be explained. Preston lay in the snow, bleeding from his nose, and with his rifle confiscated, screaming about assault and lawyers, and how they were all going to prison, how his father would destroy them all, how he would personally see to it that the village was bulldozed and turned into a company town. It was Sarah who ended it. Sarah, who walked out of the schoolhouse where she'd been grading papers by lamplight, who stood over Preston in her teaching clothes and worn boots, who looked down at him with the same expression she used when correcting homework. "You came here to hurt me," she said, her voice carrying across the wind. "You flew through dangerous weather with a rifle because you couldn't accept that someone told you no. You risked your life and everyone else's life because your ego was more important than basic human decency. And now you're threatening these people. Good people who have done nothing except protect their community from a predator. Is there any part of you that recognizes how pathetic this is? How your privilege has rotted your soul so completely that you think you're the victim here? The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the wind and the distant crack of ice. Preston stared up at her, and something in Sarah's words, or her tone, or maybe just the accumulated weight of his failures, hit him in a way that violence never could. He started crying, actual tears cutting tracks through the blood and snow on his face. And it was ugly crying, the kind that comes from a place deeper than rage, from realizing that you've become something contemptible, and everyone can see it. "I didn't mean to," he said, and his voice was small and lost. "I just wanted you to like me. Everyone's supposed to like me. My father said if I came up here and did a good job, proved I could handle responsibility, he'd put me in charge of operations. But I couldn't even do that right. I can't do anything right." Sarah felt something shift inside her, not forgiveness exactly, but recognition, seeing past the entitled monster to the damaged child underneath, understanding that cruelty often grows from untreated pain, that bullies are usually people who were themselves bullied by expectations, or family, or circumstances. But understanding didn't mean excusing, and recognition didn't mean forgetting the hurt he had caused. "What you wanted doesn't matter," she said, her voice still firm but without cruelty. "What you did matters. The girls you hurt matter. The fear you spread matters. And now you get to choose what kind of man you become. Someone who learns from this and does better, or someone who hides behind money and lawyers and becomes exactly like your father. But that choice doesn't erase consequences. That's not how justice works." The territorial marshal arrived 3 days later, when the weather cleared, flew in with 2 deputies and a magistrate, ready to investigate an incident that had been reported with very different versions, depending on who was telling the story. Preston's father had filed charges against David Onegic for assault, against the village council for false imprisonment, against Sarah Morrison for filing false reports and slander. But the marshal, a man named Henriksen, who had been working Alaska long enough to recognize the difference between law and justice, took one look at the situation and understood exactly what was happening. He interviewed every witness separately, recorded their statements with careful attention to detail, examined the helicopter that Preston had taken without authorization, documented the rifle and the blood, and the fact that Preston had flown through weather that had killed experienced pilots. He spent an evening with David Onegic, 2 veterans talking about the Aleutians, and about duty, and about what it meant to protect your community, and somewhere in that conversation, Henriksen made a decision that his superiors in Juneau wouldn't like, but that he could defend if pressed. He arrested Preston Fairchild III for assault with a deadly weapon, for reckless endangerment, for criminal trespass, and for violating territorial aviation regulations, read him his rights in front of the assembled village, and transported him to Kotzebue in handcuffs. When Preston's father arrived by private plane the next day, bringing lawyers and threats and checkbooks, Henriksen met him on the airstrip and explained in language that left no room for misunderstanding that the charges were legitimate, the evidence was overwhelming, and any attempt to interfere with the investigation would result in additional charges for obstruction of justice. "Your son came here drunk with a loaded rifle," Henriksen said, his voice flat as the tundra. "He had every intention of committing violence, probably murder, if I'm reading the evidence correctly. The only reason he's alive and not being charged with murder himself is because this community showed more restraint and mercy than he deserved. You can spend your money on lawyers, and you probably will, but you can't buy your way out of this one. Alaska's changing, Mr. Fairchild. The territory's going to be a state soon, and when it does, the old ways of doing business are done." The trial happened in June in Kotzebue, when the sun never set, and the tundra was covered in wildflowers, and the mosquitoes were so thick they formed clouds. The territorial prosecutor was a young woman named Jennifer Coleman, who had been looking for a case that mattered, who had been tired of processing routine offenses and wanted something that would make a difference. And when she read the files on Preston Fairchild, she saw not just one case, but a pattern. Not just one victim, but dozens. She tracked down the girls from Shishmaref and the mine kitchen, the ones who had been paid to disappear, and she built a case that was about more than one incident in Kivalina, but about systematic abuse of power, about how wealth had been used to silence victims and corrupt justice. The Fairchild family lawyers were everything you'd expect. Expensive suits, law degrees from prestigious universities, a willingness to say anything and destroy anyone to protect their client. They attacked Sarah's character, questioned her motives, suggested she had provoked Preston, implied that her teaching methods were unorthodox and that she had an agenda. They portrayed Preston as a troubled young man who had made mistakes but deserved another chance, whose entire future was being destroyed by what his lead attorney called a momentary lapse in judgment. But Coleman was relentless, bringing witness after witness to testify about Preston's behavior, about the systematic campaign of harassment, about the fear he had spread through multiple communities. And when Sarah took the stand, wearing her best dress and speaking in the same clear voice she used to teach multiplication tables, she didn't just describe what Preston had done to her, but what it meant, what it said about systems that protected wealth over people, about how children were watching and learning that power mattered more than justice. "I came to Alaska because I believed education could change lives," she said, looking directly at the jury. "I believed that every child deserved a chance, regardless of where they were born or how much money their parents had. But what I learned is that we can't educate children in communities where they see predators protected and victims silenced. We can't teach them about justice and fairness when we demonstrate daily that those things only apply to some people." Preston Fairchild came to my school with a rifle because he believed that I didn't matter, that Native children didn't matter, that remote villages were places where he could do whatever he wanted without consequences. If we don't prove him wrong, we're telling every child in every village that he was right. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours, returned guilty verdicts on all charges, and the magistrate sentenced Preston to 3 years in territorial prison plus 5 years probation, ordered him to pay restitution to his victims, and issued a permanent restraining order preventing him from entering any Native village without explicit permission. His father was in the courtroom when the sentence was read, and the color drained from his face as he realized that his money hadn't been enough, that his influence had finally found its limits, that his son was going to prison like a common criminal. Preston himself sat motionless, staring at his hands, and when the marshals came to take him away, he looked back at Sarah one time, and there was something in his expression that might have been understanding, or might have been hatred, or might have been the first glimmer of genuine remorse. Sarah never found out which, because she never saw him again, but years later, she received a letter postmarked from Seattle, 5 pages of small, careful handwriting, in which Preston Fairchild detailed his time in prison, his work with a therapist who specialized in treating men who had abused women, his efforts to make amends to the people he had hurt, his understanding that some things couldn't be forgiven, but could only be carried forward as lessons. The letter ended with 3 sentences that Sarah kept in her desk drawer for the rest of her teaching career. "You were right about everything. I was a monster made by privilege and protected by wealth, and you showed me the mirror. I can never undo what I did, but I can choose to become someone different, and I wanted you to know that I'm trying." The aftermath of the trial rippled outward in ways Sarah couldn't have predicted. The case became something of a landmark, referenced in discussions about territorial justice and indigenous rights, used as an example in law schools about the intersection of wealth, power, and accountability. Jennifer Coleman went on to become Alaska's first female attorney general after statehood, and she always credited the Fairchild case as the one that taught her about the difference between law and justice. David Anagik was honored by his village and by Native organizations throughout Alaska for his courage in standing up to protect a teacher, and his story joined the rotation of stories told during winter nights about honor and duty and what it meant to be a man. The Territorial Education Board, embarrassed by how close they had come to dismissing an excellent teacher because of pressure from wealthy interests, implemented new policies about teacher protection and evaluation that made it harder to remove educators based on complaints from outside parties. But the most significant change happened in Kivalina itself, where the case became a turning point in the village's relationship with outside authority. A moment when they demonstrated that they could protect their own, that their voices mattered, that documentation and persistence and unity could challenge even the wealthiest families in Alaska. Other villages took notice, began implementing their own systems of documentation and mutual protection, began demanding that teachers be evaluated on their actual performance rather than their willingness to accommodate outside interests. The pattern that Sarah Morrison had challenged didn't disappear. Patterns built over decades of injustice never disappear quickly, but it weakened, developed cracks, became visible in ways that made it harder to ignore. Sarah taught in Kivalina for 15 more years, turned down job offers from larger schools with better pay and easier conditions because she had found something in that remote village that mattered more than comfort or convenience. She saw Lisa Kuna graduate from high school in Nome with honors, watched her go to college in Seattle and return as a certified teacher, eventually taking over the Kivalina school when Sarah retired. She taught Tommy Anagic through high school, encouraged his gift for engineering, helped him get admitted to the University of Alaska, where he earned a degree in mechanical engineering, and returned north to work on projects that brought modern infrastructure to remote villages without destroying their culture. She taught hundreds of other students, some of whom stayed in the village, and some of whom went to cities, but all of whom carried with them the lessons she had taught. That dignity couldn't be bought or sold. That courage was standing up even when you were afraid. That justice was something you created through action, not something you waited for authorities to grant you. She married David Anagic's nephew, a quiet man named Joseph, who hunted and fished and carved ivory, and who understood that his wife's calling was teaching and supported her without question. She learned to speak in Yupiaq fluently, participated in traditional ceremonies, earned the kind of respect that came not from degrees or credentials, but from years of consistent action aligned with values. When Alaska achieved statehood in 1959, she was part of the celebration in Kivalina, and when the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act was passed in 1971, she helped village elders understand the legal language and implications, used her education to serve rather than to dominate. The years transformed the village as they transformed all of Alaska, bringing satellite communications and snowmobiles and eventually internet connections, eroding some traditions while strengthening others, creating a complex mix of old and new that required constant navigation. Sarah navigated it alongside her students and their families, never pretending to have all the answers, always willing to admit when she didn't understand something, always centering the voices of the people who had lived on this land for thousands of years. She watched climate change begin its work on the Arctic, saw the sea ice form later each fall and break earlier each spring, understood that the children she taught would inherit a world facing challenges she couldn't fully comprehend, but she also saw resilience, saw communities adapting as they had always adapted, saw the value of traditional knowledge combined with modern education, saw young people who were proud of their heritage and capable of engaging with the wider world on their own terms. When she finally retired in 1978 at the age of 58, the village held a celebration that lasted 3 days, with families traveling from all over Northwest Alaska to honor her, with stories shared about the impact she had made, with gifts of ivory carvings and fur mukluks, and a hand-sewn parka that represented months of work. But the gift she valued most was a simple thank you card signed by every student she had ever taught, with a message that read, "You taught us that we mattered. That's the only lesson that really counts." Looking back across those years, Sarah Morrison understood that the confrontation with Preston Fairchild had been both smaller and larger than it seemed at the time. Smaller because it was just one incident among thousands, where privilege and power tried to crush dignity and courage, where wealth attempted to silence conscience, where the systems built to protect people instead protected their oppressors. It hadn't fundamentally changed Alaska or America or human nature, hadn't eliminated injustice or racism or the corrupting influence of money on institutions. Preston had served his 3 years, been released on probation, had eventually inherited a reduced but still substantial portion of his father's business empire. And there were surely other people he had hurt before and after his time in prison, because reformation is difficult and genuine change is rare. But the incident was also larger than it seemed, because it demonstrated that change was possible, that individuals with courage could challenge systems, that communities, united in purpose, could protect their own, that justice, while difficult and incomplete, wasn't entirely impossible. The students Sarah taught carried those lessons forward, and they taught their own children, and those children would teach theirs. And in that way, small acts of courage in remote villages contributed to larger transformations that took generations, but were nonetheless real. The true power, Sarah came to understand, wasn't in the dramatic confrontation, or the trial, or even the verdict, but in the daily decision to show up with dignity, to treat others with respect, regardless of their power or status, to document injustice patiently, to build alliances slowly, to persist when persistence seemed pointless, to believe that education and honor and integrity mattered even when evidence suggested otherwise. The story of what happened in Kivalina spread through Alaska in the way that important stories spread, passed along in teachers' lounges and village council meetings, referenced in college classrooms and legal seminars, becoming part of the collective memory of a place trying to define itself. It became part of the narrative about Alaska's transition from territory to state, about the struggle for native rights, about the role of education in remote communities, about how justice could be found even in systems designed to thwart it. Some versions emphasized Sarah's courage, others focused on David Anagic's intervention, others highlighted the village's unity, or Marshall Henrikson's integrity, or Jennifer Coleman's prosecution. All versions contain truth, because complex events don't have single heroes or simple lessons, and different people draw different meanings from the same facts. But what every version acknowledged was that something significant had happened, that a line had been drawn and defended, that a community had demonstrated its values in a way that couldn't be ignored or forgotten. Young teachers heading north to remote villages heard the story and drew courage from it, understanding that they wouldn't be entirely alone, that someone had been there before and survived and even thrived. Native communities used it as an example when pushing for greater sovereignty and self-determination, as proof that they could protect their own when given the authority and support. Women working in male-dominated fields carried it as evidence that standing up to harassment was possible and necessary, and sometimes even successful. And Preston Fairchild himself, in his letter years later, acknowledged that the incident had saved his life by destroying his illusions, that prison had been terrible but necessary, that he had been headed toward something far worse than incarceration if someone hadn't finally held him accountable. What would you have done, standing in that one-room schoolhouse with a drunk man who had just locked the door, knowing that help was hours away, and that the systems designed to protect you were compromised by the same wealth and power that enabled your attacker? Would you have fought back, or tried to talk him down, or frozen in fear, or run if you could? There's no judgment in asking, because everyone likes to believe they would be brave. But courage is something that exists in specific moments under specific circumstances, and none of us truly know our own capacity for it until we're tested. Sarah Morrison discovered her courage, not in that single moment, but across years of smaller decisions. To come to Alaska in the first place, to stay through the difficult winter, to document every incident instead of giving up, to maintain her dignity when provoked, to trust in the community she served, even when official systems failed her. That's the part of the story worth remembering, the accumulation of small brave acts that built toward a larger one. The way character is formed through daily choices that seem insignificant at the time, but define who we become when crisis arrives. The dramatic moments make for better storytelling. The confrontation with Preston, or the moment David took him down in the snow, or the trial testimony that swayed the jury. But the real heroism was in the 300 days of teaching before the attack, in the patience Sarah showed with students who were behind, in the hours she spent learning in Yupiaq vocabulary so she could communicate better with families, in the cold nights she sat up documenting incidents that she hoped would never need to be used, but carefully recorded anyway. The moral of this story, if stories have morals beyond the ones we assign them, is that justice is something we create through action rather than something we wait for systems to provide, that true power comes from community and character rather than wealth and position, that dignity is more durable than privilege, and that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act honorably despite it. It's about understanding that systems built to protect the powerful can be challenged by the organized resistance of those they were designed to marginalize, that documentation and persistence and unity can overcome money and influence, that one person with courage and integrity can inspire others to find their own. It's about recognizing that wealth and position don't make someone strong, just insulated from consequences, And that true strength is measured by how we treat those who can't fight back, not by our ability to dominate others. It's about the difference between reformation and justice, understanding that while individual bad actors might or might not change, the important work is building systems and communities that make it harder for them to cause harm in the first place. And it's about hope, not the naive hope that everything works out fine if you just believe hard enough, but the hard-earned hope that comes from seeing real people in real places, doing real work to make the world slightly less unjust, one school and one village and one brave act at a time. If this story resonates with you, if you've seen systems fail to protect the vulnerable, or watched wealth corrupt institutions, or witnessed courage in unexpected places, share it with others who need to hear it. Not because sharing a story changes anything material in the world, but because stories shape how we understand possibility, because knowing that others have stood up successfully makes us more likely to stand up ourselves, because collective memory of resistance builds toward collective action. Subscribe to hear more stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, about communities protecting their own, about the slow, difficult work of creating justice in unjust systems. Comment below with your own experiences of standing up to power, or witnessing courage, or finding allies in unexpected places, because these stories matter, and the people who lived them deserve to be remembered and honored. And if you're currently in a situation where you feel powerless against wealth or position or corrupt institutions, remember Sarah Morrison teaching by lamplight in the Arctic darkness. Remember David Anagic standing up to protect someone his community had adopted. Remember an entire village choosing documentation and unity over fear and isolation. You're not alone. The work is hard, and the systems are broken, and justice is never guaranteed. But courage is contagious, and persistence compounds, and sometimes, just sometimes, standing up for what's right actually works. That's the story worth telling, worth remembering, worth living, that honor and dignity and community can challenge even the most entrenched privilege, not easily and not always, but often enough to matter, consistently enough to try. The blood drained from Garrett Holloway's face as the federal marshal read the charges aloud in the packed courtroom, each word landing like a hammer blow against his carefully constructed empire. Wire fraud, reckless endangerment, obstruction of justice, manslaughter. His $1,000 suit suddenly felt like a prison uniform, and the mahogany walls of the courthouse that his father's money had helped build now seemed to close in around him. Through the gallery windows, he could see the protesters holding signs with Sarah Chen's face, the horse trainer, whose death had been dismissed as a tragic animal attack for 18 months until her daughter refused to let the truth stay buried. Garrett's hands trembled as he gripped the defendant's table, the same hands that had signed the permits to remove the electric fence, the same hands that had ordered the feed storage moved closer to the tree line, the same hands that had texted his foreman to ignore the wildlife warnings, because we don't have time for this environmental bullshit. But what these arrogant bullies didn't know was that every text, every email, every corner they'd cut to push a working-class woman off land they wanted for their luxury development would come back to haunt them. Subscribe now to witness how an ordinary daughter became an extraordinary force for justice, how a community finally said enough, and how the powerful learned that some debts can never be paid with money alone. But let's rewind to where it all began, 18 months earlier, when the morning mist still hung over Running Creek Ranch, and Sarah Chen was alive, brushing down her favorite mare while humming an old country song her daughter had loved since childhood. The ranch sat in a valley between two mountain ridges in northwestern Montana, 40 acres of grassland and pine forest that had been in the Chen family since Sarah's grandfather bought it in 1972 with money saved from 3 decades of railroad work. Sarah had inherited it when her parents died in a car accident 12 years ago, and she'd turned it into one of the most respected equestrian training facilities in the region, despite operating on a shoestring budget that required her to do most of the work herself. She was 42 years old that spring, with weathered hands and laugh lines around her eyes, her black hair starting to show silver at the temples, always wearing the same faded Carhartt jacket and Levi's that had seen better days. She'd raised her daughter Maya alone after Maya's father left when the girl was 3, working dawn to dusk 6 days a week, training other people's expensive horses, while barely making enough to keep the property taxes paid and the barn in decent repair. But she never complained, never cut corners on the animal's care, never turned away a horse that needed training just because the owner couldn't pay her full rate. Maya, now 24 and working as a paralegal in Missoula 2 hours away, would drive home every other weekend to help with barn work and bring groceries she knew her mother wouldn't buy for herself, because she'd spend the money on horse feed first. The ranch bordered the Lewis and Clark National Forest on 2 sides, which meant wildlife was a constant presence, something Sarah had learned to manage over 2 decades. She'd installed an electric fence along the tree line in 2015 after a black bear got into the feed storage, and she kept her garbage locked in a bear-proof container, hung bells on the fence posts, and always carried bear spray on her belt when she worked near the forest edge. She taught Maya from childhood that you respect wildlife by giving it space and not creating attractants, that bears and mountain lions were just trying to survive, same as everyone else, and that most attacks happened because humans got careless or arrogant about sharing the land. Sarah knew every inch of her property, could tell you which trees the elk rubbed against in autumn, where the mule deer bedded down in winter, which trail the coyotes used to cross from one ridge to another. She understood that she was a guest in their territory as much as they were visitors to hers, and that mutual respect was what kept everyone safe. Maya had learned everything about horses from her mother, starting with mucking stalls when she was 7 and graduating to basic training techniques by the time she was 16. She'd considered making it her career, but chose law instead, partly because she wanted to make enough money to help her mother retire someday, partly because she'd seen how hard Sarah worked for so little financial security. Still, some of Maya's best memories were of summer mornings in the barn, her mother's patient voice explaining how to read a horse's body language, how to stay calm when an animal spooked, how to build trust through consistency rather than dominance. Sarah had a gift for working with difficult horses, the ones other trainers had given up on, the ones labeled dangerous or untrainable. She'd proved dozens of times that most problem horses just needed someone to listen to what they were trying to communicate through their behavior. Owners would bring her horses that bucked, that reared, that refused to load into trailers, and Sarah would spend weeks building relationship before she ever tried to address the specific issue. She taught Maya that rushing was how you got hurt, that horses could sense fear and impatience, that real training was 90% patience and 10% technique. The Chen family had always been working class, the kind of people who fixed things with duct tape and wire until they could afford the proper repair, who bought their clothes at thrift stores and considered eating out a special occasion. Maya remembered her mother wearing the same winter coat for 15 years, remembered summers when Sarah would skip meals to make sure there was enough food in the house, remembered watching her mother calculate bills at the kitchen table with a worried expression that disappeared whenever Maya walked into the room. But Sarah never made Maya feel poor or deprived. She'd emphasize what they had rather than what they lacked, pointing out that they owned their land outright with no mortgage, that they had healthy horses and a roof that mostly didn't leak, that they had each other and work they believed in. Still, Maya understood from an early age that money meant security, that her mother's financial stress came from having no safety net, that one bad season or major veterinary bill could tip everything into disaster. It made Maya study harder, work harder, determined to build the kind of stability her mother had never known. Sarah's support system was small but loyal. Her closest friend was Marcus Webb, a 68-year-old Vietnam veteran who owned the neighboring property and ran a small sawmill. Marcus had been friends with Sarah's father and had appointed himself her unofficial protector after both parents died, helping with repairs she couldn't afford to hire out, checking on the property when she traveled to horse shows, sitting on her porch on summer evenings, sharing stories and beer. He taught Maya to shoot when she was 12, insisting that any woman living in rural Montana needed to know how to handle a rifle safely. And he'd been the one to give Sarah her first bear spray when she'd mentioned seeing tracks near the barn. Marcus had seen combat, had killed and nearly been killed, and it had left him with a gentle philosophy about violence as a last resort. He'd tell Maya that real courage wasn't about fighting, but about knowing when to fight and when to walk away. That the men who bragged about being tough were usually the ones who'd never been tested. His cabin was visible from Sarah's kitchen window, close enough that she could call him if she needed help, but far enough that they both had privacy. The other person Sarah relied on was Tom Redfeather, a Blackfeet elder who worked as a part-time farrier and had been shoeing Sarah's horses for years. Tom was in his 70s, with white braids and hands that could gentle the most nervous horse, and he'd grown up in these mountains when wildlife management meant respecting old knowledge about how to coexist. He'd warned Sarah 3 years ago that he was seeing more grizzly sign than usual, that the bear's traditional food sources were under pressure from climate change and development, that ranchers needed to be extra careful about securing livestock and garbage. Sarah had listened and adapted her practices, doubling down on precautions, but Tom had also warned her about the greater threat, the one she couldn't fence out or spray away. Developers were eyeing the valley, he'd told her, rich people from Seattle and California who wanted to build luxury retreats and didn't care about the families who'd worked this land for generations. Tom had seen it happen on reservation land and in valleys all over Montana, had watched as property taxes climbed and working people got squeezed out by the wealthy, buying up parcels for vacation homes they'd use 2 weeks a year. Sarah had first heard about Holloway land development in the fall of 2018, when Garrett Holloway himself had driven up her long dirt driveway in a Tesla that probably cost more than her annual income. He was 36 years old, University of Montana business degree, heir to his father's commercial real estate fortune, with perfect teeth and expensive sunglasses, and the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. He'd offered to buy her property for what he called a generous price, but what she recognized as about 60% of its actual market value. She'd politely declined, explained that the ranch wasn't for sale, that it was her family's legacy and her livelihood. Garrett had smiled like she'd told a joke and said everyone had a price, that she should think about it because development was coming to the valley, whether she liked it or not, that she could either profit from progress or get left behind. Sarah had stood her ground, kept her voice level and polite, and told him no means no before asking him to leave. She'd watched his expensive car navigate her rutted driveway and felt a cold knot in her stomach because she recognized the type. Men like Garrett didn't handle rejection well, didn't understand that some things weren't for sale, didn't accept that a working-class woman could tell them no and mean it. Maya had been furious when her mother told her about the encounter, had wanted to drive home immediately and confront this asshole developer, but Sarah had calmed her down with the patient logic she used on spooked horses. "They can't force us to sell," she'd said. "We own the land free and clear, and there's nothing he can do about that." Maya had felt uneasy anyway, had researched Holloway land development and found a pattern of aggressive acquisitions, properties bought through shell companies, complaints from former landowners about harassment and intimidation tactics that stopped just short of being prosecutable. She'd printed out articles and brought them home, but Sarah had brushed off her concerns with frontier stoicism. "We're not going anywhere," she'd said, "and bullies like that lose interest when you don't give them the reaction they want." Maya had inherited enough of her mother's stubborn optimism to believe her, or at least to want to believe her, though the paralegal training she'd received had taught her that rich people who wanted something badly enough usually found ways to get it. The valley where Running Creek Ranch sat had been getting more attention from developers over the past 5 years as Montana's outdoor recreation economy exploded and wealthy outsiders discovered the state's beauty. Properties that had been in the same families for decades were being bought up and converted into luxury vacation rentals, hunting lodges, wellness retreats, and gentleman ranches where tech millionaires could play cowboy on weekends. The locals watched with mixed feelings as property values climbed and family wage jobs stayed flat, as the character of small towns changed from working communities to tourist destinations, as ranch land got subdivided into 5-acre parcels for McMansions. Some people sold out and left, taking the money and starting over somewhere cheaper, but others like Sarah dug in and refused to be displaced from the only home they'd ever known. The tension between old Montana and new Montana was palpable at the feed store and the bar, in conversations about property taxes and water rights, and who belonged, and who was just passing through with money to burn. Garrett Holloway represented everything Sarah had taught Maya to be wary of. Privilege without wisdom, wealth without work, power without accountability. He'd grown up in Bozeman in a house with 6 bedrooms and a 4-car garage, had attended private schools, and gotten into University of Montana not on merit, but on his father's donations. Had never worked a job where he punched a clock or worried about making rent. His father, Richard Holloway, owned commercial properties across Montana and Wyoming, shopping centers and office buildings and apartment complexes, and had built a reputation as a shrewd businessman who played hardball and won. Garrett was following in those footsteps, specializing in rural land acquisition and development, pitching investors on Montana's potential as a luxury destination. He'd assembled a team of lawyers, county officials, and construction contractors who helped him navigate zoning laws and environmental regulations, who knew which palms to grease and which politicians to court. His vision for the Running Creek Valley was a boutique resort development called Mountain Heritage Estates, luxury cabins on 2-acre lots, selling for $800,000 each, with a central lodge and spa, riding stables for guests to pretend they were real ranchers, and manicured trails through what would be left of the forest after construction. Sarah's 40 acres sat right in the middle of Garrett's planned development zone, an inconvenient obstacle to his vision of geometric perfection. He'd already acquired 2 neighboring ranches through private purchases, had options on 3 more properties pending, and had preliminary approval from the county planning board for his concept development. But his architects kept running into the problem of Sarah's land, which couldn't be worked around without compromising the project's aesthetic and flow. Garrett had tried twice more to buy her out through increasingly aggressive offers, sending lawyers with purchase agreements and veiled warnings about eminent domain, having his father reach out through business associates. But Sarah had stood firm every time. She didn't care about his offers, or his timelines, or his vision for the valley's future. Her roots went deeper than his money, and she wasn't interested in being part of progress that meant erasing working families from landscapes their labor had shaped. What Maya would later discover was that Garrett had started viewing Sarah not just as an obstacle, but as an enemy who needed to be removed by any means necessary. He'd assembled a small group of enforcers around him, young men from wealthy Montana families who shared his sense of entitlement and his contempt for people they considered beneath them. There was Brad Mitchell, whose father was a federal judge, who'd been kicked out of 2 colleges for academic dishonesty, but kept landing on his feet through family connections. There was Kyle Santos, a county sheriff's deputy who'd grown up rich in Billings and used his badge to harass people Garrett identified as problems. And there was Garrett's cousin Derek Holloway, a construction foreman who ran the crews that would build Mountain Heritage Estates, and who'd learned from his uncle Richard that rules were for poor people and lawyers were for fixing mistakes. Together, they formed a toxic core of privilege and cruelty, men who'd never faced real consequences and couldn't imagine a future where anyone could hold them accountable. Sarah first sensed the escalation in January 2019 when she started finding her property damaged in small ways that could be explained as accidents or wildlife activity. A section of fence cut, a gate left open overnight, letting horses into the wrong pasture. Bags of feed slashed and ruined, her mailbox knocked over. At first, she attributed it to teenage pranks or random vandalism, fixed the damage and moved on. But Marcus Webb wasn't so sure. He'd seen similar patterns before, had watched as developers softened up stubborn landowners with harassment designed to be deniable, to make people feel unsafe and isolated until selling seemed like relief. He started spending more evenings on Sarah's porch, his truck parked visibly in her driveway, his presence a deterrent to anyone who might be watching. Tom Redfeather agreed with Marcus's assessment, told Sarah that sometimes the most dangerous predators walked on 2 legs, advised her to start documenting everything with photos and dates. Sarah had resisted the paranoia at first, didn't want to believe that her neighbor's children would do this or that anyone would stoop so low over a land dispute. But the incidents kept happening with a frequency that suggested intention rather than coincidence. In February, someone drove through her front pasture in the middle of the night, leaving deep tire ruts that took her 2 days to repair and traumatizing her horses with the noise and intrusion. In March, she found antifreeze poured in her water trough, which could have poisoned every horse on the property if she hadn't noticed the smell before they drank. That incident crossed a line from property damage to attempted animal cruelty, and Sarah finally called the sheriff's office to file a report. Deputy Kyle Santos responded to the call, took notes without interest, and suggested that maybe she was being careless with her own maintenance, that ranchers sometimes forgot what they'd done and blamed others for their own mistakes. Sarah had felt her face flush with anger at the condescension, but had kept her voice steady as she pointed out the antifreeze bottle left at the scene, the footprints in the mud, the obvious evidence that someone had entered her property with malicious intent. Santos had shrugged and said he'd include it in his report, but that without witnesses or camera footage, there wasn't much the sheriff's department could do. When Maya heard about this, she'd driven home immediately and helped her mother install security cameras at the barn and main gate. Cheap systems bought on Amazon, but better than nothing. The cameras worked as a deterrent for exactly 3 weeks before someone spray-painted the lenses in the middle of the night. The footage showed dark figures in masks and hoodies who kept their faces turned away from the cameras, who moved with the confidence of people who knew they wouldn't face consequences, even if identified. Sarah had felt something shift in her chest watching that footage, a cold understanding that whoever was doing this had resources and protection, that this wasn't random teenage mischief, but a coordinated campaign to make her feel vulnerable. She'd called Maya in tears for the first time in years, not from fear, but from rage at the injustice of it, at the reality that she could work hard and follow all the rules and still have no protection against people with money and connections. Maya had filed a formal complaint with the county sheriff's office, had insisted on meeting with the sheriff himself rather than just Santos, but Sheriff Doug Pearson had given them the same dismissive response. He'd suggested Sarah was paranoid, that she was imagining patterns where none existed, that maybe city lawyers shouldn't come home telling their mothers to see conspiracies in ordinary rural crime. Maya had felt her professional composure crack at that moment, had stood up and told the sheriff that his department's indifference was being documented, and that accountability was coming whether he took it seriously now or later. What Maya couldn't have known then was that Sheriff Pearson and Deputy Santos were both on Garrett Holloway's payroll, receiving consulting fees from a shell company registered to Richard Holloway's corporate umbrella in exchange for flexible interpretation of laws and willingness to look the other way when Garrett's interests needed protecting. The corruption was subtle enough to be technically legal, county officials accepting business opportunities and campaign contributions from developers, while making decisions that favored those same developers. A system of soft bribes that Montana's weak ethics laws couldn't effectively regulate. Garrett had learned from his father that you didn't have to break laws when you could buy the people who enforced them. That power wasn't about force, but about relationships and leverage and knowing whose palms to grease. He'd cultivated these relationships since returning to Montana after business school, had positioned himself as a young visionary bringing prosperity to rural communities, had donated to sheriff's campaigns and planning commissioner campaigns and county commissioner campaigns until he had a network of obligated officials who owed him favors. The harassment escalated again in April when someone started a small fire in Sarah's equipment shed, burning up her lawnmower, her tools, and thousands of dollars worth of tack and horse equipment she couldn't afford to replace. The fire department ruled it arson but couldn't identify suspects, and the insurance company fought her claim by suggesting she'd staged it herself for the payout. Sarah had stood in the ashes of her shed and felt something inside her harden, a realization that she was in a fight whether she wanted to be or not. That retreat wasn't an option because she had nowhere else to go. Marcus had arrived within an hour of the fire, had walked the property with her checking for other damage, and had finally said what they were both thinking. "This is Holloway," he'd said quietly. "This is what rich men do when poor women won't give them what they want." Tom Redfeather had come the next day with sage and tobacco, had conducted a small ceremony to cleanse the negative energy, and had given Sarah a piece of hard advice. "Evil finds the cracks," he'd said. "You need to seal every gap, eliminate every vulnerability, because men without honor will exploit any weakness they discover." Sarah had taken that advice seriously and implemented a new security protocol. She started sleeping with her cell phone and a loaded rifle within reach. She installed motion sensor lights around the barn and house. She stopped working near the forest edge alone and always carried her bear spray and an air horn. She kept Marcus's number on speed dial and established a check-in routine where she'd text him every morning and evening so he'd know immediately if something was wrong. She documented everything in a spiral notebook that she kept in her truck, noting dates and times and descriptions of every suspicious incident, every strange vehicle she saw on the road, every interaction with officials who should have been helping but weren't. Maya had insisted on copying all this documentation and storing it with a lawyer friend in Missoula, creating a redundancy in case something happened to the originals. They were building a case without quite knowing what kind of case it would become, just understanding instinctively that evidence would matter eventually. But what neither Sarah nor Maya understood yet was the extent to which Garrett had corrupted the systems meant to protect people like them. The county planning board chairman was Richard Holloway's college roommate. The local judge who handled land disputes had received $50,000 in campaign contributions from Holloway family trusts. The environmental inspector who was supposed to enforce wildlife protection regulations had been promised a high-paying job with Holloway Land Development after he retired. The town's weekly newspaper had become dependent on advertising revenue from Holloway properties and refused to run stories critical of the family's business practices. Even the state wildlife officials, who were supposed to investigate the antifreeze incident, had been pressured by their supervisor, who'd been pressured by a state legislator, who'd been pressured by Richard Holloway's lobbyist. The entire system had been systematically compromised through legal but deeply unethical manipulation, creating an environment where people with money operated under different rules than everyone else. In May, Garrett made one more attempt at a purchase offer, this time doubling his original price and having his lawyers draft documents that promised Sarah could stay on as property manager for the development's riding stables, a job that would pay her more than she currently made while eliminating her ownership and autonomy. Sarah had read through the offer carefully, had recognized it for the insult it was, the assumption that she could be bought if the price was high enough, or that she'd trade her independence for employee security. She'd torn up the documents in front of Garrett's lawyer and said 7 words that would be quoted in court a year later. "My home is not for sale." The lawyer had warned her that she was making a mistake, that Garrett's patience had limits, that continued resistance would only make things harder for her. Sarah had shown him to the door with frontier courtesy that couldn't quite mask her contempt. After he left, she'd sat at her kitchen table and cried, not from fear, but from exhaustion, from the grinding stress of being under siege in the only home she'd ever known, from the unfairness of having to fight this battle alone against enemies with unlimited resources. That night, she'd called Maya, and they'd had the conversation Sarah had been avoiding for months. "Maybe you should sell," Maya had said carefully. "Not because the offer is good, but because I don't know how much more of this you can take." Sarah had been quiet for a long moment before responding. "If I sell," she'd said, "they win. And the next woman who tells them no will face the same harassment because no one ever stood their ground." Maya had felt pride and fear in equal measure, understanding that her mother was choosing principle over safety, that this was a battle they might lose, but that loss would come at a cost to their enemies. What would you have done in Sarah's place, faced with the choice between security, bought through surrender, or poverty, defended with dignity? It's easy to judge from safety, harder to choose courage when you're the one standing in the crossfire. The women had agreed that night to see it through, to document everything, to look for allies and legal strategies, to believe that justice existed somewhere beyond Garrett Holloway's purchased influence. June brought an escalation that moved from harassment to direct sabotage, with life-threatening implications. Someone cut the electric fence along the forest edge during the night, disconnecting it in a way that looked like simple equipment failure, but that Sarah recognized as deliberate because the backup battery had been removed, and the wiring cut with tools rather than damaged by weather or animals. This was catastrophic because the electric fence was her primary defense against bears attracted to the horse feed, and because June was when grizzlies emerged from their winter dens hungry and ranging widely for food sources. Sarah had discovered the damage during her morning rounds and had immediately started temporary repairs with insulators and wire she kept for emergencies. But a proper fix would require new equipment she'd have to special order and couldn't afford right away. She'd called the electric fence company to explain the situation and had been told that getting a technician out to her rural location would take a week, maybe 2, and that the repair would cost $1,500 she didn't have in her account. She'd hung up feeling the walls close in, understanding that this particular act of sabotage had created a genuine safety crisis that couldn't be postponed or worked around. Marcus had helped her string rope and bells along the fence line as a temporary measure, inadequate but better than nothing. And Tom Redfeather had performed a territory blessing and left tobacco offerings to the bears in the traditional way. Both men had offered to take shifts watching the property at night, but Sarah had refused, unwilling to put them at risk for her battle. She'd moved the feed storage further from the tree line and had started sleeping in the barn rather than the house, keeping her rifle loaded and her phone charged, ready to respond if something went wrong with the horses. Maya had wired her mother money for the fence repair and had driven home the next weekend with a new motion-activated camera system that ran on solar panels and cellular data, something harder to sabotage than the previous setup. They'd installed the cameras together, working in the June heat, and Maya had felt a shift in their relationship as she realized her mother was no longer the invulnerable protector of her childhood, but a woman under siege who needed help and shouldn't have to face this alone. The week after the fence was cut, Sarah started seeing fresh grizzly sign around the property. Tracks in soft ground near the forest edge, scat along the tree line, bark stripped from aspens where bears had been rubbing. This was normal enough for the season and the location, but the volume of signs suggested multiple bears or one bear making frequent visits, and the direction of the tracks suggested they were coming from the mountains directly behind her property where the forest was densest. Tom had examined the sign and confirmed her worry. "You've got a sow with cubs," he'd said, "and she's probably investigating all the smells coming from your barn. Mothers with cubs are the most dangerous because they're protecting their young and can't afford to take chances with perceived threats." He'd advised Sarah to be extra vigilant, to make noise when moving around the property, to never corner or surprise a bear, to have her bear spray accessible at all times. Sarah had followed his advice religiously, had warned the clients who came to pick up their horses, had posted signs on her gates about bear activity in the area. She'd done everything right according to Montana wildlife protocols, had balanced her need to maintain her business with respect for the dangerous predators who shared the landscape. What Sarah didn't know was that Garrett had ordered his construction foreman Derek to make the property even more attractive to bears, as part of a campaign to create conditions that would force her to abandon it or face impossible insurance costs. Derek had hired 2 of his workers to distribute fish carcasses and cooking grease along the forest edge on Sarah's side of the boundary, creating scent trails and attractants that would draw bears toward her barn and corrals. This was wildly illegal under Montana's wildlife harassment laws and violated Federal Endangered Species Act protections for grizzlies, but Derek had assured the workers that no one would ever know and that they'd each get a $500 bonus for their silence. The workers had done it at night, wearing dark clothes and gloves, distributing the attractants in places where they wouldn't be immediately visible, but would create a lasting scent signature that would interest every bear within a 5-mile radius. It was a calculated attempt to weaponize wildlife against Sarah, to create a situation where her insurance would be canceled or her business would become unsustainable because clients wouldn't risk bringing horses to a property with such heavy bear activity. The strategy worked better than Garrett had planned. By mid-June, Sarah was seeing bears almost daily, including the sow, with 2 cubs that Tom had warned about, and a massive male grizzly that looked to weigh 600 pounds and showed no fear of human presence. Sarah had reported the increased activity to Montana Fish Wildlife and Parks, but the agency was understaffed and overwhelmed with calls about bear-human conflicts across the state. They'd sent her information about deterrence and safety practices she was already implementing, and had suggested she consider temporarily boarding her horses elsewhere if she felt unsafe, advice that was practically useless for someone whose livelihood depended on training horses on her own property. 2 clients had already pulled their horses citing safety concerns, and Sarah knew others were nervous, knew that her reputation and business were being destroyed through circumstances that seemed natural, but that she suspected were anything but. She tried to explain her suspicions to a wildlife officer who'd called to follow up, but without evidence of deliberate attractants or harassment, there was nothing anyone could do except wait for the bears to move on naturally or for Sarah to change her operations. Maya had come home the last weekend of June to help her mother reinforce the barn and install additional locks and security measures, but both women knew they were treating symptoms rather than causes, that no amount of defensive preparation could eliminate the threat of a curious or hungry bear deciding to investigate the property. They'd worked together in the summer heat, hanging additional bells, installing motion sensor lights along the barn perimeter, securing every potential entry point. And Maya had felt a growing dread that something terrible was building, that they were on a collision course with disaster and didn't have the power to change direction. That Sunday evening, before Maya drove back to Missoula, she'd hugged her mother longer than usual and had made her promise to call immediately if anything felt wrong, if any situation seemed dangerous, if she needed help of any kind. Sarah had promised, had stood in the driveway waving as Maya's old Honda disappeared down the dirt road, had felt a premonition she couldn't name as she turned back to face another week alone with horses and bears and enemies she couldn't see or fight. The attack happened on the last Tuesday of June, just after dawn, when the light was still gray and the mist was rising from the valley floor. Sarah had done her usual morning check, walking the fence line with her bear spray on her belt and her air horn in her hand, scanning the tree line for movement or fresh sign. The horses were nervous that morning, ears forward and nostrils flaring, telling her something was nearby, even if she couldn't see it yet. She decided to move them into the barn earlier than usual to keep them secured until whatever was spooking them moved on. And she was leading the first mare across the paddock when she heard the sound that every Montana rancher dreads, the woofing grunt of an agitated grizzly, close enough that she could hear it over the horse's hooves and the morning birds, close enough that her body responded before her mind fully registered the danger. She turned toward the sound and seen the sow emerging from the trees at the north fence line, massive and dark against the pine shadows. 2 cubs trailing behind her, but the mother focused entirely on Sarah and the horse in the paddock between the barn and the forest edge. Sarah had done everything right in that moment. Everything Montana wildlife training teaches. She'd held still, made herself look bigger, spoke to the bear in a calm voice while slowly backing toward the barn, kept the mare between her and the bear as a buffer, reached for her bear spray while fighting the instinct to run that would trigger a chase response. The sow had stood on her hind legs, 7 feet of muscle and teeth, testing the air and evaluating the threat level. And for a moment, Sarah thought the encounter would end the way most do, with the bear deciding to leave and taking her cubs back into the forest. But then something shifted, some calculation in the bear's mind, and she dropped to all fours and began moving towards Sarah with purpose rather than curiosity. Sarah had deployed her bear spray, a 5-second burst that should have been enough to turn any bear, but the wind was wrong, and most of the spray dispersed before reaching the sow, and the small amount that did connect only enraged rather than deterred her. The bear had charged, covering the distance faster than Sarah could process, and there'd been no time to run, no time to reach the barn, no time to do anything except raise her arms and scream, hoping someone would hear and help. The sow had hit Sarah like a freight train, 800 pounds of terrified protective mother responding to what she perceived as a threat to her cubs, knocking the woman to the ground with casual violence that broke ribs and drove the air from Sarah's lungs. The bear had bitten Sarah's shoulder, shaking her the way a dog shakes a toy, then had thrown her aside and stood over her, determining whether this human was still a threat or had been neutralized. Sarah had played dead the way you're supposed to, hands protecting her neck, legs drawn up, trying not to whimper or scream despite the agony in her shoulder and chest, praying that the bear would decide she'd won and leave. And after what felt like hours, but was probably less than a minute, the sow had done exactly that, woofing to her cubs and leading them back toward the tree line at a lope, leaving Sarah bleeding and broken in the paddock but alive, her cell phone smashed in the attack, but her mind still working enough to know she needed help immediately. But the horses, the animals Sarah had spent her life understanding and respecting, had been driven into a panic by the bear attack and the smell of blood. They'd broken through the paddock gate in their terror, 6 horses stampeding away from the danger, and Sarah had been directly in their path as she tried to crawl toward the barn. The first horse had jumped over her, hooves missing her head by inches, but the second hadn't cleared her completely, its rear hoof catching her left leg and snapping it like kindling. The third horse had stepped directly on her back, 1,200 pounds of blind terror, crushing vertebrae and driving broken ribs into her lungs. The fourth and fifth had trampled her without even slowing, and by the time the 6th horse thundered past, Sarah Chin was gone, killed not by the bear attack she'd survived, but by the animals she'd dedicated her life to protecting and training, a death so cruel and ironic that it seemed designed by a malicious universe. Marcus Webb had found her an hour later when he came over for their usual morning check-in and saw the horses running loose and the paddock gate smashed open. He'd called 911 while running toward where Sarah lay in a spreading pool of blood, had dropped to his knees beside her and checked for a pulse he knew he wouldn't find, had felt rage and grief slam into him like a physical force. The EMTs had arrived within 20 minutes, followed by the sheriff's deputies and the wildlife officers, and they documented what appeared to be a straightforward wildlife attack gone tragically wrong. The county coroner had ruled it death by traumatic injuries consistent with large animal trampling following a bear encounter, and Montana Fish Wildlife and Parks had filed the incident in their database of the human-bear conflicts that killed 2 or 3 people every year in the state. Deputy Kyle Santos had written his report with barely concealed satisfaction, noting that the deceased had ignored multiple warnings about bear activity and had failed to implement adequate safety measures, implying through his word choice that Sarah had been negligent and had brought her death on herself through poor judgment. Maya had gotten the call at her law office in Missoula from Marcus, who could barely speak through his tears, and she'd felt the world fall away beneath her feet. The 2-hour drive home was a blur of shock and disbelief, her mind unable to accept that her mother was gone, that the woman who'd seemed indestructible had been killed by the land she loved and the animals she devoted her life to understanding. Marcus had met her at the ranch with Tom Redfeather, both men looking destroyed, and they'd walked her through what they knew, shown her where it happened, helped her start making the calls and arrangements that follow a sudden death. Maya had stood in the paddock where her mother died and felt something crack inside her, a breaking of the person she'd been, and the beginning of someone harder who understood that grief was a luxury she couldn't afford until she had answers and justice. The investigation into Sarah's death was cursory at best, deliberately negligent at worst. Sheriff Pearson had closed the case within 48 hours, ruling it an accidental death from wildlife encounter with no suspicious circumstances, and no need for further inquiry. The insurance company had denied Maya's claim for death benefits, citing Sarah's alleged negligence in maintaining inadequate bear deterrence. The county had sent Maya a bill for the emergency response services. Garrett Holloway had sent flowers to the funeral with a condolence card that barely masked his satisfaction that the obstacle to his development had been removed. And through it all, Maya had felt a cold certainty growing in her chest that this wasn't an accident, that her mother's death was the culmination of months of harassment and sabotage, that somewhere in the chain of events were decisions and actions by people who needed to be held accountable. She'd taken a leave of absence from her paralegal position and moved into her mother's house, determined to find evidence that everyone else had dismissed or ignored, to honor her mother's memory by ensuring the truth didn't stay buried. The first thing Maya did was examine every inch of the property, documenting everything with her phone's camera, taking measurements and notes with the thoroughness her legal training had taught her. She'd found the cut electric fence and photographed the clean tool marks that proved sabotage rather than weather damage. She'd found remnants of the fish carcasses and grease that Derek's workers had distributed, now mostly consumed by scavengers, but still faintly visible in rotting piles that shouldn't have been anywhere near Sarah's property. She'd found tire tracks near the tree line that matched the pattern of tires used on Holloway Land Development work trucks. She'd interviewed every neighbor within 5 miles, asking questions that law enforcement should have asked but hadn't, building a timeline of suspicious vehicles and nighttime activity that correlated perfectly with the harassment incidents. And she'd found an ally in Marcus Webb, who'd been conducting his own investigation and who brought his military training to the task of gathering evidence that could survive legal scrutiny. Together, Maya and Marcus had built a file that suggested a pattern of harassment, sabotage, and ultimately criminally negligent conduct that had created the conditions for Sarah's death. Marcus had done something brilliant that Maya's legal training had missed. He'd taken samples of the grease and fish remains and sent them to a forensic lab in Denver, paying for analysis out of his own pocket. And the lab had identified commercial cooking grease from a restaurant supply company and salmon carcasses that had been purchased from a fish processor, both items that could be traced through sales records to Derek Holloway's construction company accounts. This was the kind of evidence that transformed speculation into proof, that connected Garrett's organization to the deliberate attracting of bears to Sarah's property. Marcus had also installed his own trail cameras along the property boundary weeks before Sarah's death, hoping to catch whoever was harassing her, and those cameras had captured Derek's workers distributing the attractants, their faces partially visible and their vehicle license plates readable in the night vision footage. Maya had taken this evidence to the sheriff's office, expecting action and receiving dismissal. Sheriff Pearson had refused to even look at the trail camera footage, had told Maya that she was seeing conspiracies where none existed, that her grief was causing her to blame innocent people for a tragic accident, that she should accept her mother's death and move on rather than making accusations she couldn't prove. His contempt had been naked, his protection of the Holloways barely disguised, and Maya had understood in that moment that local law enforcement would never deliver justice because they were part of the corruption. She'd walked out of the sheriff's office and driven straight to the Montana Department of Justice in Helena, where she'd requested a meeting with the Attorney General's office and filed a formal complaint alleging corruption in her home county and requesting a criminal investigation into her mother's death. The Assistant Attorney General who met with Maya was a woman named Jennifer Martinez, 40 years old, daughter of immigrant farm workers, someone who'd built her career prosecuting corruption and white-collar crime, and who recognized immediately that Maya's case had merit. Martinez had listened for 3 hours as Maya walked through the timeline, the evidence, the pattern of harassment, and the way local officials had blocked investigation at every turn. She'd reviewed the forensic analysis of the grease and fish, watched the trail camera footage, examined the photos of the cut fence and the suspicious tire tracks, and she'd made a decision that would change everything. "I'm opening a criminal investigation," Martinez had said, "and I'm going to assign a special investigator and bring in federal authorities because this touches on wildlife harassment, which is a federal offense. You've done excellent work gathering this evidence, and now I need you to trust the process and let us take it from here." Maya had cried then, the first real tears she'd allowed since her mother's death, not from sadness but from relief that someone in authority was finally taking her seriously and treating her mother's death as something more than an unfortunate accident. The investigation that followed was conducted quietly at first, with state investigators gathering additional evidence and conducting interviews without alerting Garrett or his associates that they were being investigated for anything more serious than zoning violations. Federal wildlife agents had examined the grease and fish distribution sites and confirmed that someone had deliberately created artificial attractants in violation of the Endangered Species Act and Montana's wildlife harassment statutes. Financial investigators had started tracing the flow of money between Holloway companies and local officials, uncovering the consulting fees and campaign contributions that constituted a corrupt network. Digital forensic specialists had obtained warrants for Garrett's phone and email records, discovering the text messages and communications that proved he'd ordered the fence sabotaged and the attractants distributed. The investigation took 4 months, and Maya spent those months living in her mother's house, caring for the horses that had survived, trying to keep the ranch running while waiting for justice. Marcus Webb had become Maya's anchor during those months, cooking meals she forgot to eat, handling barn work she didn't have energy for, sitting with her on the porch during the long summer evenings when grief threatened to drown her. He'd shared stories about Sarah, about the young woman who'd inherited a struggling ranch and turned it into something special through sheer determination, about the mother who'd raised a daughter alone while never making her feel the weight of their poverty, about the friend who'd never asked for help but accepted it with grace when offered. Marcus had also shared his own story, about Vietnam and the things he'd done and seen, about how violence marks you forever, and how the only redemption comes from protecting others and standing against cruelty wherever you find it. He told Maya that her mother had been one of the good ones, someone who made the world better simply by existing in it, and that the best way to honor her was to ensure that her death had meaning, that the corruption that caused it was exposed and punished, that other working families didn't face the same crushing injustice. Tom Redfeather had also stayed close, performing ceremonies to help Sarah's spirit rest, and teaching Maya about the indigenous perspective on justice and accountability. Justice isn't revenge, he'd explained. It's about restoring balance, about ensuring that harm is acknowledged and amends are made. The Blackfeet tradition holds that when someone dies violently or wrongfully, their spirit can't rest until their community addresses the imbalance their death created by seeking accountability for her mother's death. Maya wasn't just pursuing legal justice, but participating in something deeper, something that had been part of this land's wisdom for thousands of years before white people brought their corrupt institutions and flexible ethics. Tom had helped Maya understand that her mother's death was part of a larger pattern, that developers and corporations had been displacing native people and working-class families for generations, that the struggle she was engaged in was older than any of them and would continue after they were gone, but that each person who stood their ground mattered. Each refusal to be bought or intimidated weakened the system of oppression just slightly. The arrest warrants were served on October 15th, 6 months after Sarah's death, in a coordinated operation that involved state investigators, federal wildlife agents, and the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. Garrett Holloway had been taken into custody at his office in Bozeman, led out in handcuffs past his employees and the expensive art on his walls while charges were read that included conspiracy, wildlife harassment resulting in death, wire fraud, obstruction of justice, and manslaughter. Derek Holloway had been arrested at his construction site, his workers watching as agents documented evidence and seized his computer and phone. Brad Mitchell had been arrested at his father's house, his federal judge father powerless to prevent it and visibly shocked at the extent of his son's involvement. Kyle Santos had been arrested at the sheriff's office itself, his badge and gun confiscated, while his fellow deputies tried to process the betrayal, and Sheriff Doug Pearson had been served with subpoenas and informed that he was under investigation for corruption and obstruction, though criminal charges against him would come later after investigators finished tracing his financial connections to the Holloways. The arrests had made regional news immediately and national news within days. The story of a working-class horse trainer killed through wildlife harassment, orchestrated by wealthy developers, proving irresistible to media hungry for narratives about corruption and inequality. Reporters had descended on Running Creek Ranch, interviewing Maya and Marcus, photographing the paddock where Sarah died, covering the story with the intensity it deserved. The attorney for Montana had held a press conference outlining the charges and thanking Maya Chin for her courage in pursuing justice despite intimidation and official indifference. Environmental groups had seized on the case as an example of how wealthy developers flouted wildlife protections with impunity. Indigenous organizations had highlighted it as another instance of land theft and violence against rural communities. And across Montana, people who'd felt powerless against wealthy interests saw the arrests as proof that accountability was possible if someone was brave enough to stand up and demand it. The legal proceedings that followed were complex and lengthy, with multiple defendants facing different charges and different potential sentences. Garrett Holloway's lawyers had tried to argue that he'd known nothing about the specific actions his employees took, that he couldn't be held responsible for their independent decisions, but the text messages and emails told a different story. The digital evidence showed Garrett explicitly ordering Derek to make the property unlivable, discussing strategies for using wildlife to create insurance problems, celebrating each incident of harassment as progress toward his goal. Brad Mitchell had tried to claim he was just along for the ride, that he'd never participated directly in the sabotage, but his own text messages showed him scouting the property and providing intelligence about Sarah's routines and vulnerabilities. Derek Holloway had initially refused to cooperate, maintaining the code of silence he'd learned from his uncle Richard, but when faced with 20 years in federal prison for his role in causing a human death through wildlife harassment, he'd accepted a plea deal in exchange for testimony against Garrett and Richard. The trial of Garrett Holloway began in March, 9 months after Sarah's death, in a Helena courtroom packed with supporters of Maya and opponents of development corruption. The prosecution, led by Jennifer Martinez, had presented a devastating case built on documentary evidence, forensic analysis, witness testimony, and Garrett's own words. They'd shown the jury the trail camera footage of Derek's workers distributing fish and grease, They'd presented the forensic analysis proving those materials came from accounts controlled by Garrett's company. They displayed the text messages where Garrett ordered the fence cut and discussed using bear attractants to force Sarah off her land. They'd called witnesses who described the systematic harassment, the official indifference, the corrupt network that had enabled months of escalating attacks. And they'd ended with Maya Chen taking the stand, describing her mother's dedication to her horses and her land, the fear and stress of the final months of her life, and the cold certainty that her death could have been prevented if anyone in authority had taken her complaints seriously. Garrett's defense had tried to create reasonable doubt by arguing that Sarah's death was ultimately caused by an animal attack, and that the bears would have been in the area regardless of any attractants, that you couldn't predict or control wildlife behavior, that tragic accidents happen in rural Montana regardless of human actions. But the prosecution had countered with expert testimony from wildlife biologists who explained that creating artificial attractants dramatically increased the likelihood of bear-human conflict, that the pattern of bear activity around Sarah's property was consistent with deliberately concentrated scent markers, that while no one could make a bear attack someone, you could create conditions that made attacks significantly more likely. The prosecution argued that this was no different than cutting someone's brake lines and then claiming you weren't responsible when they died in a car crash, because brake failure could happen naturally. Garrett's actions had created a foreseeable risk, and when that risk resulted in exactly the tragedy any reasonable person could have predicted, he bore legal and moral responsibility for the death that followed. The jury had deliberated for 3 days before returning their verdict: guilty on conspiracy charges, guilty on wildlife harassment charges, guilty on obstruction, and most significantly, guilty of manslaughter, finding that Garrett's actions had directly created the conditions that led to Sarah Chin's death, and that even though he hadn't personally attacked her, he bore criminal responsibility for the foreseeable consequences of his criminal conduct. The courtroom had erupted in applause and tears, with Maya sobbing into Marcus's shoulder while Tom Redfeather sang a Blackfeet honor song for Sarah's spirit. Garrett had stood frozen at the defense table, his face pale, his expensive suit suddenly looking like the costume it had always been, his privilege finally insufficient to protect him from accountability. The judge had remanded him to custody immediately pending sentencing, and he'd been led out of the courtroom in handcuffs while his lawyers scrambled to prepare appeals they knew were unlikely to succeed, given the strength of the evidence and the clarity of the verdict. The other defendants had faced their own reckonings in separate proceedings. Derek Holloway received 12 years in federal prison after his plea deal with additional restitution payments to Maya. Brad Mitchell received 8 years for conspiracy and obstruction, with his father's judicial reputation permanently tarnished by association. Kyle Santos lost his badge and received 6 years for corruption and abuse of authority under color of law, with recommendations that he never work in law enforcement again. Sheriff Doug Pearson resigned under pressure and faced his own charges, ultimately pleading guilty to corruption in exchange for a 3-year sentence and agreement to testify about the network of compromised officials across Montana. Richard Holloway, though not charged criminally, faced civil suits from Maya and investigations by state regulators that would destroy his real estate empire and reputation. The entire corrupt network that had enabled Sarah's death had been systematically dismantled, each participant held accountable in proportion to their role. But the story's most unexpected redemption came from one of Derek's workers, a 23-year-old named Jake Morrison, who'd been one of the men paid to distribute the fish in Greece. Jake had grown up poor in Billings, had taken the construction job because he needed money, and didn't ask questions about assignments that seemed sketchy. But after Sarah's death, after learning he'd played a role in creating the conditions that killed a woman who reminded him of his own grandmother, Jake had been destroyed by guilt. He'd gone to the investigators voluntarily before arrests were made, had provided detailed testimony about what he'd been asked to do and how it was supposed to work, had cooperated fully even though it meant facing charges himself. Jennifer Martinez had been moved by his genuine remorse and his recognition that poverty didn't excuse participation in evil, and she'd recommended minimal charges and community service rather than prison time. Jake had attended Sarah's memorial service uninvited, standing in the back with tears streaming down his face, and had approached Maya afterward to apologize and take full responsibility for his actions. Maya had accepted his apology after a long, hard look, recognizing in his broken demeanor someone who understood he'd made a terrible choice and would spend his life trying to atone. Jake had become a voice for accountability, speaking at community forums about how ordinary people get recruited into corrupt schemes through financial pressure and weak ethics. And his testimony had helped convict the others while saving his own soul. At Garrett Holloway's sentencing hearing in May, the judge had listened to victim impact statements from Maya, Marcus, Tom, and members of the rural community who'd been affected by the Holloway's predatory development practices. Maya had spoken last, her voice steady and clear as she described her mother's life and death, the systematic destruction of a family's security for corporate profit, and her determination that Sarah's death would mean something, that it would end the pattern of wealthy interests crushing working people with impunity. She'd quoted her mother's final statement to Garrett's lawyer. "My home is not for sale," Sarah had said, and Maya had added, "Either is my silence, neither is my courage, neither is the truth about what you did and why you did it." The judge had nodded throughout Maya's statement, and when it came time to impose sentence, he departed from standard guidelines to impose the maximum allowed: 23 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for at least 15 years, restitution payments to Maya totaling $800,000, and a lifetime ban from any business involving real estate development or land acquisition. This wasn't just justice for Sarah Chen, the judge had said. This was a message to every wealthy developer who thought rural people were obstacles to be removed, rather than neighbors to be respected. That Montana's land and people weren't for sale to the highest bidder, regardless of the moral cost. The sentence had sent shockwaves through Montana's development community, forcing a reckoning about practices that had been accepted as normal business for decades. Other counties had launched investigations into similar patterns of harassment and corruption. The state legislature had passed new laws, strengthening wildlife protection and prohibiting the use of artificial attractants to create nuisance situations. The Montana Bar Association had sanctioned several lawyers who'd helped Garrett structure his harassment campaign. And across the state, working families who'd felt powerless against wealthy interests took courage from Maya's example, understanding that justice required persistence and evidence and willingness to stand against institutions that preferred comfortable lies to difficult truths. Sarah Chen's death had become a catalyst for systemic change, her sacrifice not meaningless, but transformative in ways she never could have imagined while she was alive, defending her 40 acres against enemies she never should have had to face. Maya had kept the ranch, using part of the restitution money to make repairs and improvements Sarah never could have afforded, turning it into a memorial to her mother's legacy and a working training facility that served Montana's horse community. She'd partnered with Marcus to create a nonprofit that provided free legal assistance to rural landowners facing pressure from developers, using her legal training to help others navigate the systems that had initially failed her family. She'd worked with Tom Redfeather to establish a traditional Blackfeet blessing ceremony that honored Sarah's spirit and the land she'd loved, creating a small memorial garden on the property where people could pay respects and reflect on the values Sarah had embodied. And she'd made sure that every student who came to the ranch to learn about horses learned also about Sarah's story, about the cost of standing up to corruption, about the difference between strength and cruelty, about the courage required to say no to power and mean it. Marcus Webb had lived long enough to see justice delivered and Sarah honored, but he'd passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 years after the trial, his heart finally giving out after 7 decades of carrying the weight of the things he'd seen and done. Maya had found him on his porch, his face peaceful, Tom Redfeather's number written on a note beside him, asking that the elder perform the burial ceremony. At Marcus's funeral, Maya had spoken about how he taught her that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the choice to act rightly, despite it, that real strength meant protecting others, not dominating them, that the measure of a life wasn't wealth or status, but the impact you had on people who needed someone to stand with them. Marcus had been that someone for Sarah, and then for Maya, and his example had rippled outward through the community until his death left a hole that could only be filled by the values he'd embodied. Tom Redfeather continued his work as an elder and teacher, using Sarah's story in his workshops about indigenous perspectives on land and justice. He'd tell young people that the earth doesn't belong to us, but that we belong to the earth, that our responsibility is stewardship, not ownership, that the Holloways of the world would always exist trying to turn sacred relationships into commodity transactions. But that resistance is also eternal. and each generation must choose which side of that struggle they'll support. Tom had blessed Maya the way he'd blessed Sarah, with sage and prayers, and the wisdom that comes from understanding how old these struggles are and how important each individual battle remains regardless. He'd lived to see Sarah's memorial garden become a place of pilgrimage for people across Montana, a symbol of resistance and resilience that gave courage to others facing similar battles. The story of Sarah Chen and her daughter Maya became part of Montana's cultural memory, referenced in legislative debates and legal precedents, taught in schools as an example of how justice requires citizen courage and institutional accountability. The case established legal principles about criminal liability for creating conditions that lead to foreseeable death, about wildlife harassment as a tool of intimidation, about the responsibility of law enforcement to protect vulnerable citizens from wealthy predators. But more than the legal precedents, Sarah's story became a moral touchstone, a reminder that every life has value, regardless of economic class. That home means more than property value, that some things should never be for sale at any price. Maya continued her mother's work with horses while building a legal practice focused on rural justice, becoming exactly the kind of advocate her mother had needed but couldn't find when she needed it most. She'd taken the lessons Sarah taught her about patience and consistency with horses and applied them to the slow work of systemic change, understanding that transformation doesn't happen in dramatic courtroom moments, but in the daily choice to resist corruption and defend dignity. She'd married a fellow advocate and had 2 children who grew up learning to ride on Running Creek Ranch, learning their grandmother's story, understanding that they came from people who chose integrity over comfort and courage over safety. The ranch thrived under Maya's care, becoming profitable enough to support itself and several employees, proving that ethical business was possible even in industries dominated by exploitation. The Mountain Heritage Estates development was never built. The property Garrett had acquired was tied up in legal proceedings for years, then sold to a conservation trust that preserved it as open space and wildlife habitat. The valley, where Sarah died, remained largely unchanged, working ranches and forest, ordinary people living ordinary lives without the burden of luxury development, transforming their community into a playground for the wealthy. Some developers learned from Garrett's fate and modified their practices, operating with more respect for existing communities and environmental limits. Others simply moved to states with weaker laws and more corrupt officials, continuing the same patterns elsewhere. But in Montana, at least for a while, there was a pause, a moment when power faced accountability and lost, when the narrative that money could buy anything crashed against a mother's refusal to sell her home, and a daughter's refusal to let her mother's death be dismissed as an unfortunate accident. Years later, when people asked Maya how she'd found the strength to fight an enemy with so many advantages, she'd think about her mother standing in the driveway the day Garrett first made his offer. Think about the quiet dignity in Sarah's voice when she said, "My home is not for sale." Think about the values transmitted through a lifetime of watching her mother choose honor over convenience, even when honor made everything harder. Strength isn't something you find, Maya would explain. It's something you inherit from people who stood firm when standing was difficult. It's something you build through small choices, made consistently over time. It's something that grows when you protect others, knowing you might not survive the conflict, but believing the protection matters anyway. Her mother had possessed that strength even though she died before seeing justice. And Maya had simply continued what Sarah started, refusing to let trauma become the final word. The final truth about Sarah Chen's death and Maya's fight for justice is that it revealed something fundamental about power and resistance, about systems designed to protect the wealthy at everyone else's expense, about the courage required to dismantle those systems, one exposed corruption at a time. Garrett Holloway had believed his privilege made him untouchable, that his father's money and connections created a protective barrier around anything he chose to do, that working-class people like Sarah were expendable obstacles rather than human beings with equal moral standing. He'd been wrong, but that wrongness only became visible because Maya refused to accept the official story, because Marcus and Tom stood with her, because Jennifer Martinez chose to prosecute rather than look away, because a jury of ordinary Montanans decided that some boundaries couldn't be crossed regardless of how much money you had to spend on lawyers. Justice isn't automatic or inevitable. It's something that must be fought for continuously by people willing to stand up when standing up carries a cost. If you found this story meaningful, if it reminded you of your own battles against powerful interests that seemed invincible, if it gave you hope that accountability remains possible even when institutions fail their basic obligations, then share it widely so others can draw courage from Sarah and Maya's example. Like this video if you believe that working families deserve protection from predatory developers, that wildlife shouldn't be weaponized for profit, that corruption should face consequences regardless of how much money tries to hide it. Subscribe to this channel to see more stories about ordinary people who became extraordinary through their refusal to surrender justice for convenience, about the true cost of standing firm and the greater cost of backing down, about courage that inspires others and integrity that outlasts opposition. Comment below with your own experiences fighting against systems designed to crush dissent, with your thoughts about how we create accountability when institutions are corrupted, with your commitment to stand with the next person who faces what Sarah faced and needs allies who won't look away. The story of Sarah Chen doesn't end with Garrett Holloway in prison or Maya running the ranch, or even with the systemic changes their battle achieved. It ends with the question that every person reading this must answer for themselves. When faced with the choice between safety through surrender or risk through resistance, between accepting injustice as inevitable or fighting despite long odds, between protecting yourself or defending others even when defense costs everything, which person will you become? Sarah chose resistance and paid with her life, but her death sparked a movement that protected countless others from similar fates. Maya chose to honor her mother by refusing to let powerful people bury the truth along with the body, and her choice transformed grief into justice and loss into legacy. The question for you, for all of us, is whether we have the courage to make the same choice when our moment comes, when someone needs an ally and looking away would be easier, when the system is rigged but resistance remains possible if we're willing to pay its price. Sarah and Maya have shown us the way. Now, we must decide whether we'll follow their example or become the next generation that enables corruption through silence and complicity. That choice, made individually by millions of people, in small moments, determines whether their sacrifice meant something, or whether the Garrett Holloways of the world continue crushing ordinary people who dare to say that some things will never be for sale, regardless of how much money comes knocking. Choose wisely, choose courageously, and remember that honor and integrity outlast wealth and power if someone is brave enough to defend them when defense means risking everything. Sarah Chen's legacy lives in every person who refuses to be bought, who stands firm when standing costs everything, who believes that home and dignity matter more than survival purchased through surrender. May we all possess her strength when our testing comes. The snow fell heavy that November morning in 1994 when Colonel Dmitry Volkov finally understood what fear truly meant, not the theoretical fear discussed in Moscow officer academies or the calculated risks outlined in military doctrine, but the primal terror of staring into the dark eyes of a Kamchatka brown bear defending territory the colonel had no right to violate. The bear stood 9 feet tall on its hind legs, its breath creating clouds of steam in the frozen air, its massive paws equipped with claws that could tear through the colonel's winter uniform as easily as paper. Volkov's hands trembled as he fumbled for his sidearm, his usual swagger and authority meaningless in the face of nature's indifference to rank and privilege. The ammunition depot behind him contained enough explosives to level a city block, but in that moment, with half a ton of apex predator advancing toward him, all his stolen money and corrupt connections couldn't save him from the consequences of his own arrogance. What these privileged bullies never understand is that eventually, whether through human justice or the universe's own corrections, every act of cruelty demands payment in full. But this story isn't really about the bear, though that magnificent creature played its part in the final chapter of Justice. This is about how corruption festers in isolated places, how power corrupts absolutely when unchecked, and how sometimes the universe has its own way of balancing the scales when human systems fail. Subscribe now to witness a tale of honor, survival, and the kind of justice that can't be bought or intimidated into silence. Share this story if you believe that truth eventually surfaces, no matter how deep it's buried in Siberian snow. But let's rewind to where it all began, 8 months earlier, in March of 1994, when Private Alexei Volkov, no relation to the colonel, despite the shared surname, arrived at the remote Kamchatka Peninsula military outpost, with nothing but his worn duffel bag, his late father's dog tags, and a determination to honor the man who had raised him alone after his mother died in childbirth. Alexei was 22 years old, with the compact build and weathered features of someone who grew up in Russia's far eastern territories, where survival required more than just luck. His father had been a decorated sergeant who served in Afghanistan, a man who taught his son that strength wasn't about dominating others, but about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The old man had died of complications from a war wound just 6 months before Alexei's conscription, leaving his son with a small apartment in Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky, a city where fishing boats outnumbered opportunities, and where young men either joined the military or the fishing fleets. The bus ride from the regional processing center to Bas-Volkov took 9 hours along roads that barely deserved the name, passing through landscapes so stark and beautiful they made Alexei's chest ache with something between loneliness and awe. The Kamchatka Peninsula was one of Russia's most remote regions, a land of active volcanoes, dense forests, and coastlines where brown bears outnumbered people. The base itself sat in a valley between 2 mountain ranges, established during the Cold War to store tactical nuclear weapons that had since been removed, leaving behind conventional ammunition dumps, crumbling barracks, and a skeleton crew of soldiers maintaining equipment that hadn't been modern even in the 1980s. The post-Soviet military was a shadow of its former self, plagued by budget cuts, corruption, and a culture where China, the brutal hazing of junior soldiers, had intensified as resources dwindled and oversight disappeared. Alexei stepped off the transport truck into ankle-deep mud, the March thaw having turned the base's grounds into a morass that sucked at his boots with each step. The barracks were prefabricated concrete structures painted a depressing gray-green that matched the overcast sky, their windows clouded with grime and condensation. A group of soldiers sat smoking on the barracks steps, their uniforms slovenly, their expressions ranging from bored indifference to predatory interest as they sized up the new arrival. Alexei kept his face neutral, his father's voice echoing in his memory, with advice about surviving military service in the new Russia, where the old Soviet discipline had collapsed, but nothing better had replaced it. The base commander's office occupied a slightly better building near the center of the compound, distinguished from the other structures only by a faded Russian flag hanging limply from a pole, and a newer Mercedes sedan parked outside that seemed obscenely out of place given the decrepit surroundings. Senior Lieutenant Maxim Sokolov, the deputy commander who processed Alexei's arrival, was a lean man in his 40s, with intelligent eyes and the quiet competence of a career officer who had survived by keeping his head down and doing his job. He reviewed Alexei's papers with the tired efficiency of someone performing a routine task for the 1000th time, his expression revealing nothing as he noted Alexei's education, his father's service record, and the fact that the young private had scored exceptionally high on the marksmanship evaluations during basic training. "You'll be assigned to perimeter security and ammunition depot maintenance," Sokolov said, his voice carrying the flat accent of Central Russia. "The work is simple but essential. We maintain storage facilities for several regional bases, which means we're responsible for significant military assets despite our small numbers. Follow orders, keep your head down, and your service will pass without incident. The commander will want to meet you during the morning formation tomorrow. Until then, report to Sergeant Petrov for your bunk assignment and equipment issue." There was something in Sokolov's tone, a subtle warning that Alexei filed away for future reference, an indication that life at Base Volkov required navigation of currents that had nothing to do with official military regulations. The barracks housed 40 soldiers in a space designed for 30, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, boot leather, and the cheap cigarettes that served as an unofficial currency in Russia's cash-strapped military. Alexei's bunk was a metal frame with a thin mattress that had absorbed the shape and odors of its previous occupants, located in a corner that at least offered some privacy. His neighbors included Private Ivan Kuznetsov, a farm boy from Tambov Oblast, who had the broad shoulders and simple decency of someone raised to work hard and treat others fairly, and Corporal Yuri Nestorov, a compact Siberian from Yakutsk, whose indigenous Saka features and quiet competence reminded Alexei of the hunters and trappers he'd known growing up in Kamchatka's coastal communities. "Don't trust the veterans," Kuznetsov whispered that first night as they sat on their bunks after lights out, the darkness filled with the sounds of snoring and the occasional cry from someone lost in bad dreams. "The Dedovshchina here is worse than most places because we're so isolated. The commander doesn't care as long as it doesn't interfere with the base's real business, which has nothing to do with military readiness. Sokolov's decent, tries to keep the worst of it under control, but he's only second in command, and the colonel makes the rules. Keep your money hidden, never show weakness, and if they come for you in the night, make enough noise that Sokolov hears and has to intervene." Alexei absorbed this information with the calm his father had taught him, the understanding that information was ammunition and patience was armor. He'd heard stories about the systematic abuse of junior soldiers in the post-Soviet military, a tradition that the collapsed economy and social chaos had transformed from harsh but bounded hazing into something darker and more predatory. The newspapers occasionally reported deaths, suicides, and mysterious accidents at remote bases, where young conscripts died from pneumonia or falls that covered beatings and torture. The Soldiers' Mothers Committee tried to advocate for reform, but they had no power in a system where corruption flowed from the top down, and where commanders at remote outposts operated with near absolute authority. Morning formation introduced Alexei to Colonel Dmitry Volkov, and the man's appearance immediately explained the Mercedes and the subtle tension that permeated the base like an invisible gas. The colonel was 34 years old, but carried himself with the preening arrogance of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. His uniform was custom-tailored rather than the standard issue that everyone else wore. His boots were expensive Italian leather rather than Russian military issue, and his watch was a Swiss chronograph that cost more than a sergeant's annual salary. He had the soft face of someone who had never missed a meal, his features handsome in a weak way that suggested privilege and protection rather than earned authority. His eyes were pale blue and cold, moving over the assembled soldiers with the kind of contempt that indicated he viewed them as resources to be exploited rather than men under his command. "We have a new soldier joining our little family," Volkov announced, his voice carrying the cultured Moscow accent of the elite classes. "Private Volkov, what an amusing coincidence in names. Tell me, Private, are you perhaps a distant relative fallen on hard times? Did some aristocratic ancestor of yours marry a peasant and dilute the bloodline?" The assembled soldiers laughed on cue, the sound forced and uncomfortable from those who knew better than to remain silent when the commander made a joke. Alexei stood at attention, his face neutral, refusing to give Volkov the reaction he was clearly seeking. The colonel circled him slowly, like a predator assessing prey, noting Alexei's worn but clean uniform, his father's dog tags visible at his collar, the careful grooming that indicated self-respect, despite limited resources. "I see you wear a dead man's tags," Volkov said, fingering the metal identification discs with an expression of mild distaste. "Very sentimental, very Russian, all that patriotic nonsense about honor and sacrifice that the Soviet Union used to peddle to keep the peasants in line. Let me give you some advice, Private Volkov. Honor doesn't pay debts, sacrifice doesn't fill empty stomachs, and the only thing that matters in this world is power and the will to use it. You're here to serve, to follow orders, and to remember that I am the absolute authority on this base. Cross me, disappoint me, or fail to show proper respect, and you'll discover that remote bases have many ways for soldiers to have unfortunate accidents. Do we understand each other?" Alexei met the colonel's eyes for exactly the appropriate duration before dropping his gaze in a show of submission that was entirely strategic rather than genuine. "Yes, sir," he said, his voice neutral and professional. "I understand perfectly." What he understood was that Colonel Dmitry Volkov was everything his father had warned him about, the kind of officer who viewed command as an opportunity for personal enrichment, and who would sacrifice his soldiers' welfare without hesitation if it served his interests. What Alexei also understood, though he kept this knowledge locked behind a disciplined exterior, was that his father had taught him patience, observation, and the understanding that bullies eventually overreach if given enough rope with which to hang themselves. The work at Base Volkov followed patterns that became clear within the first week. Patterns that revealed exactly why a privileged Moscow colonel had accepted assignment to this remote outpost, when officers with his connections usually secured comfortable positions in the capital or major cities. The base's official function was ammunition storage and maintenance, providing logistics support for several regional military installations across Kamchatka and the Russian Far East. The reality was that Colonel Volkov had turned the base into his personal criminal enterprise, systematically looting the ammunition stores and selling weapons on the black market to the organized crime networks that had flourished in post-Soviet Russia's chaotic transition to capitalism. The scale of the theft was staggering. Once Alexei understood what he was seeing, trucks arrived in the dead of night, civilian vehicles with no military markings, loading ammunition crates that were then reported as destroyed during routine maintenance or damaged beyond use. The paperwork was meticulously forged, the signatures authentic, because Volkov controlled every administrative function on the base. The soldiers, who worked the midnight details, were either loyal to Volkov through bribes and privileges, or kept silent through fear of the consequences if they talked. The money flowing through the operation was substantial enough that Volkov drove a Mercedes, wore luxury watches, and lived in quarters furnished with items that had clearly come from Moscow's most expensive stores. Senior Lieutenant Sokolov was caught in an impossible position, aware of the corruption but lacking the power or resources to stop it. Alexei observed the deputy commander during their interactions, noting how Sokolov documented discrepancies in the ammunition logs, how he conducted his own inventories when Volkov was off base, how he carefully maintained records that could serve as evidence if the opportunity for justice ever arose. But Sokolov was one man in a broken system, and Volkov had protection that extended far up the chain of command. The colonel's father was a general in Moscow. His uncle sat on the Defense Ministry's Logistics Committee, and his family connections included politicians, oligarchs, and the kind of people who could make problems disappear with a phone call. Alexei's assigned duties included regular patrols of the perimeter fence and daily inspections of the ammunition storage bunkers, work that gave him unprecedented access to understand the full scope of Volkov's operation. The main ammunition depot was a reinforced concrete structure built into the side of a hill, designed during the Cold War to withstand everything short of a direct nuclear strike. The interior was organized with military precision, rows of shelves holding crates of ammunition, grenades, and other ordnance, each item supposedly logged and accounted for in the base's inventory system. But the logs were fiction, the numbers manipulated to hide theft that had been ongoing for at least 2 years since Volkov had taken command and transformed a legitimate military facility into his personal ATM. The spring thaw brought increased activity as the winter roads became passable for civilian trucks, and Volkov's smuggling operation shifted into higher gear. Alexei worked the night shifts, ordered to assist with maintenance operations that consisted of loading ammunition into unmarked vehicles, while armed men in civilian clothes supervised with the casual brutality of organized crime enforcers. These men treated the soldiers with open contempt, their expensive leather jackets and gold jewelry marking them as representatives of the Bratva, the Russian mafia networks that had filled the power vacuum left by communism's collapse. They joked with Volkov in familiar terms, calling him by his first name, discussing business deals involving weapons shipments to Chechnya, to Central Asian republics, to anyone with cash and connections. Private Kuznetsov made the mistake of asking questions about the discrepancies between the official logs and the actual inventory, mentioning to another soldier that certain crates seemed to disappear without corresponding paperwork. 3 days later, Kuznetsov was found unconscious in the shower, his face beaten so severely that his features were unrecognizable, his right arm broken in 2 places. The official report stated he had slipped on wet tiles, a story that no one believed, but that everyone accepted because to question it was to invite the same treatment. Sokolov tried to get Kuznetsov medical evacuation to the regional hospital, but Volkov delayed the authorization for 2 days, ensuring that the young soldier suffered unnecessarily, and that the message about asking questions was received by everyone on the base. Alexei visited Kuznetsov in the medical bay, a converted storage room with 2 beds and minimal supplies, and found his friend barely conscious through the pain medication that the base's medic, a conscientious older sergeant named Popov had administered against Volkov's orders. "I was stupid," Kuznetsov whispered through swollen lips. "I thought maybe if I reported it through proper channels, someone would care. But there are no proper channels anymore. The system is broken, and men like Volkov own every piece of it. Don't make my mistake, Alexei. Don't think that following the rules will protect you. The rules don't exist here." That night, alone in his bunk after lights out, Alexei made a decision that would have made his father proud, even as it terrified him with its implications. He would gather evidence of Volkov's crimes, document everything with the meticulous care that his father had taught him when maintaining equipment logs and service records. He had access to the ammunition depot. He could photograph inventory discrepancies. He could note the civilian vehicle's license plates and the faces of the crime bosses who met with Volkov. When the opportunity came, when the right moment arrived, he would ensure that Colonel Dmitry Volkov faced justice for transforming a military base into a criminal enterprise and for treating his soldiers as disposable resources in his pursuit of wealth and power. But first, he needed allies, because one private with evidence was just a target waiting to have an accident. He began with Corporal Yuri Nestorov, the quiet Yakut soldier, whose indigenous background meant he'd experienced his own share of discrimination and abuse in Russia's ethnic Russian-dominated military. They talked during night watches, sharing stories about their fathers, both men who had served with honor in a military that no longer existed. Nestorov revealed that he'd been documenting Volkov's activities in a small notebook he kept hidden in the lining of his boot, dates and times and vehicle descriptions. But like Alexei, he'd been waiting for the right moment and the right allies before taking action. Sergeant Medic Popov became the third member of their quiet conspiracy. Recruited after Alexei helped him secure additional medical supplies for Kuznetsov's care by volunteering for extra duties that no one else wanted. Popov was 48 years old, counting down to retirement, a career soldier who had joined during the Soviet era when the military was a source of stability and pride, rather than the corrupt shambles it had become. He maintained detailed medical records that documented the pattern of injuries consistent with beatings and abuse. Files that he kept in duplicate, with copies hidden off base in case Volkov decided to destroy evidence. Their opportunity came in May, when Lieutenant Sokolov approached Alexei with a proposal that indicated the deputy commander had been conducting his own campaign against Volkov's corruption. Sokolov had contacts in the regional military prosecutor's office, investigators who wanted to build a case against the weapons smuggling that was undermining Russia's military readiness and strengthening organized crime networks. But they needed witnesses, soldiers willing to testify and provide evidence, and they needed proof that could withstand the political pressure that Volkov's family connections would bring to bear. "I won't lie to you about the risks," Sokolov said during a private meeting in his quarters, speaking in tones barely above a whisper, even though Volkov was off base in Petropavlovsk. "Volkov's father is a general. His connections extend to the highest levels of government. Even with evidence, there's no guarantee of prosecution, and if the investigation fails, if political pressure kills the case, then everyone involved becomes a target. I'm only asking because I've watched you these past months, and I see something in you that reminds me of why I joined the military in the first place. You have your father's sense of duty, his understanding that honor means something, even when the system is broken." Alexei thought about Kuznetsov's broken face, about the young soldiers who arrived at the base with hope and left broken in body or spirit, about his father's teachings that strength meant protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. "I'm in," he said simply. "Tell me what you need." That single decision transformed him from victim to active participant in bringing down a corrupt commander, but it also painted a target on his back that would only grow more dangerous as their investigation progressed, and Volkov sensed the closing net. The escalation of Volkov's brutality began in June, when new conscripts arrived, and the colonel decided to assert his authority through a campaign of systematic cruelty that exceeded even the harsh norms of Dedovshchina. The new arrivals included Private Andrei Volkov, another unfortunate soul who shared the common surname, and the colonel seized on this coincidence with sadistic glee. He ordered both Alexei and Andrei to report to his office where he informed them that they would be family representatives responsible for maintaining the cleanliness of the officers' quarters, a duty that meant scrubbing floors, cleaning toilets, and enduring whatever degrading tasks Volkov invented to amuse himself. The work itself was manageable, but the psychological warfare was carefully calculated. Volkov would inspect their cleaning with white gloves, finding invisible specks of dust that required them to start over. He would call them to his office at 3 in the morning, ordering them to polish his boots or iron his uniforms while he drank imported vodka and lectured them about the natural order that placed Moscow elites above provincial peasants. He forced them to stand at attention for hours while he conducted his black market business on the phone, treating them as living furniture whose suffering meant nothing compared to his convenience. Young Andrei broke under the pressure within 2 weeks, his mental state deteriorating as sleep deprivation and constant humiliation eroded his grip on reality. Alexei tried to protect the younger soldier, volunteering for double duties and attempting to shield Andrei from the worst of Volkov's attention, but the colonel sensed weakness and pressed harder. The breaking point came when Volkov ordered Andrei to eat food that had deliberately been spoiled, claiming it would teach him not to waste resources. When Andrei refused, Volkov had him dragged to the punishment cell, a concrete box without windows or heat, where soldiers were left for days at a time with minimal food and water. Alexei went to Sokolov, begging him to intervene before Andrei died, or permanently lost his mind in solitary confinement. The deputy commander's face was gray with exhaustion and helpless rage as he explained the reality of their situation. I've tried to countermand the punishment, but Volkov has absolute authority over base discipline. I've contacted the regional command, but they defer to the base commander unless there's a death that can't be covered up. I've documented everything, but documentation means nothing without power to enforce consequences. The best I can do is ensure Medic Popov checks on him daily and that he receives adequate water to prevent dehydration. The prosecutor's investigation was moving forward, but with agonizing slowness as they built their case against Volkov's extensive criminal network. They needed evidence of actual weapons deliveries to organized crime figures, not just inventory discrepancies that Volkov's expensive lawyers could explain away as accounting errors. They needed witness testimony from the civilian drivers and crime bosses, which required offering immunity deals and protection from reprisals. And they needed to move carefully, because any indication that an investigation was underway would allow Volkov to destroy evidence and intimidate witnesses. Meanwhile, Alexei documented everything with a small camera that Sokolov had provided, taking surreptitious photographs of the midnight loading operations, capturing images of license plates and faces that could be matched to organized crime databases. Nesterov maintained his detailed logs of dates, times, and quantities. Popov added medical records to the growing dossier. But every day of delay was another day that Volkov grew more confident, more cruel, more convinced of his absolute immunity from consequences. What would you have done in Alexei's position, trapped between the necessity of gathering evidence and the reality of watching fellow soldiers suffer? Would you have acted immediately, consequences be damned, or would you have maintained the discipline to wait for the right moment? These are the questions that separate survival from martyrdom, success from noble failure. The situation exploded in mid-July, when a botched shipment of weapons ended up in the hands of Chechen separatists who used the ammunition in an attack that killed 12 Russian soldiers at a checkpoint in the North Caucasus. The regional military prosecutor's office suddenly had the political leverage they needed, because now Volkov's crimes weren't just corruption, but treason that had directly resulted in Russian casualties. The investigation accelerated. Arrest warrants were prepared, and Sokolov received word that military police would arrive within 72 hours to secure the base and place Volkov under arrest. But intelligence moves both ways, and Volkov had his own sources. Someone in the prosecutor's office or the regional command leaked word of the impending arrest, giving the colonel time to attempt to destroy evidence and eliminate witnesses. The first sign of trouble came when the base's communication systems mysteriously failed, cutting off outside contact. The second sign was when Volkov's civilian crime contacts arrived in force, a dozen armed men who began systematically going through the base's administrative offices and burning documents. The third sign was when Volkov ordered Sokolov arrested and confined to quarters under guard. effectively removing the only officer who might have maintained order. Alexei and his small group of allies found themselves in a terrifying position, possessing evidence that could destroy Volkov, but trapped on a base that had become a prison where the inmates were running the facility. The colonel assembled the soldiers in formation and delivered a speech that made his intentions brutally clear. Anyone who had participated in documenting his business activities, anyone who had spoken to investigators, anyone who had even thought about betraying his trust would be dealt with before military police arrived. There would be accidents, suicides, and unfortunate incidents in the ammunition depot where explosions could destroy evidence and bodies simultaneously. "I know some of you have been keeping notebooks," Volkov said, his voice carrying across the formation ground with the confidence of a man who had never faced real consequences. "I know some of you have talked to people you shouldn't have talked to. I want you to understand something very clearly. My family has protected czars, served general secretaries, and now prospers in the new Russia. You are nothing, you are insects, and if necessary, I will burn this entire base to ash, and everyone on it will die, heroes of the Russian Federation. Victims of a tragic accident involving unstable Cold War-era ammunition. The choice is yours. Bring me your evidence, your photographs, your notebooks, and you'll be transferred to cushy assignments far from this frozen hell. Refuse, and you'll never leave Kamchatka except in body bags." That night, terrified soldiers began turning over their documentation, surrendering notebooks and memory cards and photographs to save their own lives. Alexei watched this betrayal with a sinking heart, understanding that fear was a more powerful motivator than justice for young men who had been systematically brutalized. But he also understood that his father would never have surrendered evidence of wrongdoing, would never have traded justice for temporary safety. He gathered with Nesterov and Popov in the medical bay, where they made a pact that if they were going to die on this remote base, they would at least ensure that the evidence survived them. Nesterov had a contact in the civilian sector, a childhood friend who worked at a fishing cooperative in Petropavlovsk, and who could be trusted to safeguard documents. Without asking questions, Popov could arrange for a supply truck to take a package off base during the regular weekly delivery run. And Alexei had his father's dog tags, which contained a hollow compartment where his father had once hidden microfilm during his service in Afghanistan. They would microfilm the most critical documents, hide the film in the dog tags, and ensure that even if they died, the evidence would reach the prosecutors. But Volkov moved faster than they anticipated. The supply truck was canceled, all off-base communications were severed, and soldiers attempting to leave the base perimeter were shot at by the civilian guards that Volkov had positioned around the compound. The colonel was preparing his final solution, planning to destroy the ammunition depot with everyone inside and blame the explosion on unstable ordnance. It was a desperate plan, but Volkov was a desperate man who understood that prison would be worse than death for someone of his class and privilege. Alexei found himself thinking about stories his father had told him, tales from the Afghan War, where Soviet soldiers had been betrayed by their commanders and left to die in ambushes because some colonel wanted to cover up his incompetence or corruption. His father had survived through a combination of luck, skill, and the unexpected help of Afghan civilians who had no love for the Soviets, but who recognized honor when they saw it. The lesson had been clear. Sometimes salvation comes from unexpected sources, and sometimes the universe has its own way of balancing the scales. The next morning brought an unexpected development that would change everything. A naturalist from Moscow arrived at the base, a wildlife researcher named Dr. Elena Komarova, who was conducting a survey of Kamchatka's brown bear population, and who had permission from regional command to access military lands for her research. She was a severe woman in her mid-50s, with the kind of no-nonsense competence that came from decades of working in dangerous field conditions. Her presence was an accident of bureaucratic timing, her access permit approved weeks earlier before anyone knew that Base Volkov was about to become a crime scene. But her arrival meant that Volkov couldn't simply massacre everyone without an outside witness who would report the base's destruction. The colonel attempted charm first, offering to host Dr. Komarova in the officers' quarters and providing her with a military escort for her bear survey work. But the scientist was not impressed by his expensive watch or his Moscow accent, and she had the kind of protection that came from academic credentials and government research grants. She was also more observant than Volkov anticipated, noting the armed civilian guards, the nervous soldiers, and the general atmosphere of fear that permeated the base. When she asked pointed questions about why a remote ammunition depot needed private security contractors, Volkov's charm transformed into barely concealed hostility. Alexei was assigned as part of Dr. Komarova's escort detail, ordered to accompany her into the wilderness surrounding the base, while she tracked bear movements and collected data. It was meant as punishment, a way to get Alexei away from his allies and isolate him where an accident could occur without witnesses, but it also gave him an opportunity he hadn't anticipated. Time alone with an outside observer who might listen if he could figure out how to communicate what was happening without getting them both killed. They hiked into the hills above the ammunition depot, following game trails through forests of Ayan spruce and stone birch, the terrain steep and treacherous as they climbed toward areas where bears were known to den. Dr. Komarova moved through the wilderness with practiced ease, noting signs of bear activity, collecting scat samples, and setting up motion-activated cameras to document bear behavior. She talked while she worked, explaining her research into how human activity affected bear territories, and how the post-Soviet economic collapse had actually benefited wildlife by reducing industrial pollution and human encroachment. The bears have returned to areas they abandoned during the Soviet era, she said, examining a tree where a bear had left claw marks during territorial marking behavior. The Kamchatka brown bear is one of the largest subspecies in the world, with males reaching 800 kilograms or more. They're generally not aggressive toward humans unless protecting cubs or food sources, but they're apex predators that command respect. A bear defending its territory is absolutely unstoppable, a force of nature that ignores rank, wealth, and human delusions of supremacy. Alexei heard the message beneath her words, the understanding that she knew something was wrong on the base, and that she was offering him an opportunity if he was brave enough to take it. "Doctor," he said quietly, ensuring their military escort was out of earshot, "if you were to find a dog tag in these woods, one that contained evidence of crimes that needed to reach prosecutors, would you know what to do with it?" She met his eyes with an expression that suggested she'd been waiting for him to speak, that her apparent interest in bear behavior was cover for a different kind of investigation. "I might know several prosecutors who would be interested in such evidence," she replied carefully. "And I might know that dog tags are difficult to trace, that a scientist finding such an item during field research could easily justify delivering it to proper authorities. But I would need to understand the full situation before taking risks that could endanger both of us." Over the next hour, speaking in careful phrases during moments when they were away from the escort soldiers, Alexei outlined the scope of Volkov's criminal enterprise, the evidence they had gathered, and the colonel's plan to destroy the ammunition depot and everyone on the base to prevent his arrest. Dr. Komarova's expression grew darker as she absorbed this information, her previous calm replaced by calculating anger. "I have contacts in the regional command," she said finally. "People who owe me favors from previous research that benefited military environmental compliance programs. If I can reach a phone, if I can get word to the military police that there's an imminent threat to the base, they might be able to accelerate their timeline and arrive before Volkov can execute his plan. But we need to assume that any communication attempt will be detected, which means we need to create chaos that gives investigators a reason to rush in without waiting for bureaucratic approval." They formulated a plan that was desperate but possible, relying on Dr. Komarova's authority as a government researcher and Alexei's knowledge of the base's layout and security protocols. She would return to the base and demand immediate radio access to report a critical bear encounter, claiming that she needed to warn other research teams about increased bear aggression in the area. The military escort couldn't refuse a government scientist without creating a bureaucratic incident, especially when she was reporting a potential public safety issue. Once she had radio access, she would use coded language to alert her contacts that a hostage situation was developing at Base Volkov and that immediate military police intervention was required. Meanwhile, Alexei would need to disappear into the wilderness, taking the evidence with him and avoiding capture until help arrived. The plan relied on perfect timing and favorable circumstances, but it was better than waiting to be murdered by a desperate colonel. They returned to the base separately, Dr. Komarova loudly discussing bear sign, while Alexei maintained his role as the dutiful soldier escort. That evening, Alexei retrieved his father's dog tags from his bunk and added the microfilmed evidence that his group had prepared. The physical documentation of Volkov's crimes condensed into something small enough to hide, but durable enough to survive. The situation reached its crisis point the following morning, when one of the soldiers who had turned over his documentation was found dead in the barracks, an apparent suicide that everyone understood was murder. Volkov had demonstrated that cooperation wouldn't guarantee safety, that he planned to eliminate all potential witnesses regardless of their compliance. The base descended into chaos as soldiers realized they were trapped with the commander, who viewed them as disposable obstacles to be removed. Some attempted to flee into the wilderness, only to be shot by the civilian guards. Others barricaded themselves in buildings, trying to wait out the crisis. Dr. Komarova made her move during this chaos, storming into the communications center and demanding radio access with the authority of someone who was accustomed to being obeyed. The communications sergeant, a young conscript who was terrified of Volkov, but more terrified of the situation spiraling completely out of control, allowed her to make her transmission before the colonel could be notified. She reported a critical situation involving aggressive bears near multiple ammunition storage sites, using carefully coded language that her contacts in regional command would understand, meant something far more serious than wildlife behavior. The transmission was brief, less than 2 minutes before Volkov burst into the communications center and had her dragged away at gunpoint. Alexei used the confusion to slip away from the base, moving through terrain he'd scouted during previous patrols, heading toward the ammunition depot that sat in the hills above the main compound. If Volkov was going to destroy the depot anyway, then Alexei would position himself where he could either prevent the sabotage, or at least ensure that the evidence survived the explosion. The forest was dense with undergrowth, the ground soft from recent rain, and he moved with the quiet efficiency his father had taught him during childhood hunting trips. He reached the depot just as Volkov's civilian contractors arrived, 3 men in tactical gear carrying demolition charges and weapons. They were professionals, moving with military precision as they entered the depot and began placing charges on the support columns. Alexei observed from concealment, calculating his options, and understanding that he was outnumbered and outgunned. But he also understood that if the depot exploded, it would kill everyone on the base below and destroy all evidence of Volkov's crimes. His father's voice echoed in his memory, reminding him that sometimes the only choice was between dying like a coward or dying while protecting others. He was preparing to make a suicide attack on the demolition team, accepting that he would die, but might delay the explosion long enough for military police to arrive, when the universe intervened in the form of 800 kilograms of Kamchatka brown bear. The massive boar had been using the area around the depot as part of his territory, attracted by the relative absence of human activity and the small ecosystem that had developed around the structure's drainage system. The bear's den was less than 200 meters from the depot, and the presence of armed humans near his territory during the critical late summer feeding season triggered a defensive response that would have fatal consequences. The bear emerged from the forest with shocking speed for an animal of its size, its massive body covering ground in bounds that scattered the demolition team and sent one man screaming into the woods. The others fired their weapons, but handgun rounds had little effect on a bear this size, only enraging it further. The bear caught one contractor in its jaws, killing him instantly with a bite that crushed his skull, then turned its attention to the depot entrance where more humans were trying to escape. What happened next would become the subject of investigation and legend, a convergence of human corruption and natural justice that no one could have predicted. Colonel Dmitry Volkov arrived at the depot just as his contractors were being mauled, driving up in his Mercedes with armed reinforcements to check on the demolition progress. He stepped out of the vehicle, still wearing his expensive watch and custom uniform, his expression one of irritation rather than alarm, because he still believed that wealth and authority could solve any problem. The bear, now fully committed to defending its territory and enraged by the noise and smell of blood, focused on this new threat with single-minded intensity. Volkov fumbled for his sidearm, his hands shaking as he finally understood that money couldn't buy safety from a predator that recognized no human hierarchy. The final confrontation was brief and brutal, Volkov fired his pistol repeatedly, the shots going wild as terror destroyed whatever marksmanship training he'd received at his elite Moscow academy. The bear closed the distance in seconds, its massive paws striking the colonel and sending him crashing against the Mercedes. Alexei watched from concealment, understanding that he should feel satisfaction at seeing his tormentor destroyed, but instead, feeling only sadness that it had come to this, that systems had failed so completely that nature had to deliver justice that humans couldn't or wouldn't provide. The sound of helicopter rotors cut through the chaos as military police finally arrived, responding to Dr. Komarova's coded distress call with the urgency that the situation demanded. The tactical team arrived to find a scene of carnage, with civilian contractors dead or dying, the ammunition depot intact, but surrounded by evidence of criminal activity, and a brown bear standing guard over territory it had successfully defended against intruders. The bear was eventually shot by military police, a tragedy that Dr. Komarova would later mourn in her research papers, but not before it had prevented the demolition that would have destroyed evidence and killed everyone on the base. Alexei emerged from the forest with his hands raised, identifying himself to the military police and surrendering the evidence he'd been protecting. The dog tags containing microfilm documentation of Volkov's crimes, the physical proof that would corroborate Dr. Komarova's testimony, and the evidence that Sokolov had been maintaining. The deputy commander was freed from his confinement and immediately began working with investigators to secure the base and protect the remaining witnesses. Medic Popov provided medical treatment to the wounded, including several of Volkov's civilian contractors who survived their encounter with the bear and who would eventually provide testimony in exchange for reduced sentences. The investigation that followed was extensive and far-reaching, exposing corruption that extended well beyond base Volkov to include senior officers in the regional command and political figures in Moscow. Volkov's father, the general, was forced into retirement under a cloud of scandal. His uncle was removed from the Defense Ministry Committee. The organized crime network that had been purchasing military weapons was dismantled through a series of arrests that made international news. The Kamchatka brown bear that had killed Colonel Volkov became a symbol of natural justice in a country where human justice had become corrupted and unreliable. The legal proceedings took months, with trials held in Moscow under intense media scrutiny. Alexei testified about the systematic abuse and criminal activities he'd witnessed, his quiet dignity and clear documentation making him a sympathetic witness that defense lawyers couldn't effectively discredit. Nesterov provided his detailed logs of illegal shipments, the kind of evidence that was difficult to explain away or dismiss. Popov presented medical records documenting the pattern of abuse that had resulted in injuries, suicides, and murders disguised as accidents. Dr. Komarova testified about her observations and the coded distress call that had saved lives by bringing military police to the base before Volkov could execute his plan for mass murder. The sentences handed down were severe, reflecting both the serious nature of the crimes and the public anger about military corruption. The civilian contractors who survived received 20-year sentences for weapons trafficking and attempted murder. Officers who had enabled Volkov's activities were dishonorably discharged and received prison terms ranging from 5 to 15 years. Political figures who had protected the criminal enterprise faced investigation, and some were eventually prosecuted, though their cases moved more slowly through courts that were still influenced by wealth and connections. Private Andrei Volkov, the young soldier who had nearly been destroyed by his tormentor's psychological warfare, slowly recovered with the help of proper medical care and psychiatric treatment. The military granted him a medical discharge with benefits, recognizing that his mental health had been severely damaged by the abuse he'd suffered. Ivan Kuznetsov, whose beating had first revealed the depths of Volkov's cruelty, also received a medical discharge and compensation for his injuries. Both young men would carry physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives, but they would at least carry them as survivors rather than as victims. Senior Lieutenant Maxim Sokolov received a commendation for his efforts to document criminal activity and protect his soldiers under impossible circumstances. He was promoted and transferred to a position in the regional command, where he could help implement reforms designed to prevent another base Volkov situation. He maintained contact with Alexei, becoming a mentor and friend whose quiet competence and moral courage had helped navigate an impossible situation without losing himself to cynicism or despair. Dr. Elena Komarova published research papers about the Kamchatka brown bear that had defended its territory against human intrusion, using the incident to advocate for better protection of bear habitat and recognition of the consequences when humans disrupt natural ecosystems. She received research grants that allowed her to continue her work across Russia's far eastern territories, becoming a respected voice in wildlife conservation. She also maintained contact with Alexei, recognizing in the young soldier the same kind of courage and integrity that she'd spent her career observing in the natural world, where survival required both strength and wisdom. Alexei himself completed his military service with distinction, earning a field commission based on his actions and his clear leadership potential. He was transferred to a prestigious unit in Moscow, where his reputation as a soldier who had stood up against corruption made him valuable for reformers trying to rebuild the post-Soviet military's damaged credibility. But he never forgot the lessons learned at Base Volkov, the understanding that systems could fail, and that sometimes individuals had to risk everything to ensure that justice prevailed over power. He kept his father's dog tags, the ones that had carried evidence through chaos and danger to reach prosecutors who could act on the information. The metal discs remained a reminder of the values his father had instilled, the understanding that honor wasn't an abstract concept, but a daily choice to protect others and resist corruption. On quiet evenings, he would hold the tags and remember the brown bear that had delivered justice when human systems failed, a force of nature that recognized no hierarchy beyond survival and territory. The story of Base Volkov became part of military legend, told in barracks and academies as a cautionary tale about corruption and a redemption story about soldiers who refused to be intimidated into silence. Young officers studied the case in ethics classes, examining the choices made by various actors and discussing how similar situations might be prevented in the future. The Soldiers' Mothers Committee used the case to advocate for reforms, pointing to the systematic failures that had allowed a remote base to become a criminal enterprise where soldiers were treated as disposable resources. Years later, when Alexei had risen to command his own unit, he would return to Kamchatka during a training exercise and make a quiet pilgrimage to the site where Base Volkov had once stood. The facility had been decommissioned after the scandal, its ammunition stores redistributed to properly secured facilities, and its buildings abandoned to the elements. The forest had begun reclaiming the cleared land, birch and spruce growing up through cracked concrete, nature erasing the evidence of human occupation. He hiked up to the ammunition depot where the final confrontation had occurred, finding it empty and silent except for the wind moving through the trees and the distant sound of a river flowing through the valley below. There was a marker placed by wildlife officials, noting that a brown bear had died defending its territory in 1994, a simple acknowledgement of the natural world's intersection with human affairs. Alexei stood before the marker for a long time, thinking about his father's teachings, about the soldiers who had died because systems failed them, about the unexpected ways that justice sometimes manifested when all human institutions proved inadequate. The moral of this story, if stories need such explicit statements, is that corruption thrives in isolation and darkness, but cannot survive exposure and accountability. That systems matter, but individuals make the difference when systems fail. That wealth and privilege provide insulation from consequences until they don't. Until the universe, or nature, or simple human courage breaks through the protections that money and connections provide. That true strength comes not from dominating others, but from protecting those who cannot protect themselves, even at great personal cost. Colonel Dmitry Volkov had believed himself untouchable, protected by family connections and political power, able to exploit his soldiers and profit from military resources without consequences. He treated human beings as disposable resources in his pursuit of wealth, never understanding that every action creates reactions, and that eventually the scales balance. His death was brutal and undignified, killed by a creature that recognized no human hierarchy and that cared nothing for his expensive watch, or his Moscow accent, or his family connections. The bear delivered the kind of justice that corrupt systems could not or would not provide, a final reckoning that was fitting, even as it was tragic. But the real victory wasn't the bear attack or the colonel's death. The real victory was that soldiers like Alexei refused to be intimidated into silence, that officers like Sokolov documented crimes even when doing so put them at risk, that a civilian scientist recognized injustice and took action despite the danger, that a broken system still contained enough honest individuals that evidence reached prosecutors and justice eventually prevailed. The real victory was that young soldiers received compensation and treatment, that criminal networks were dismantled, that reforms were implemented to prevent future abuses. Sometimes justice requires courage, patience, and the willingness to risk everything for principles that seem abstract until they're tested by real-world challenges. Sometimes justice comes from unexpected sources, whether brown bears defending territory, or scientists with government credentials, or young soldiers with hidden strengths and unshakable integrity. Sometimes justice takes time, moving through channels that seem impossibly slow until suddenly everything cascades and corrupt edifices collapse under the weight of their own contradictions. If this story resonates with you, if you believe that courage and integrity matter even in systems that seem hopelessly broken, then share it with others who need to hear this message. Subscribe to hear more stories about how ordinary people navigate extraordinary circumstances, how justice eventually finds ways to manifest even against overwhelming odds, how the arc of the universe bends toward accountability if we're willing to do the hard work of bending it. Comment below with your thoughts about what you would have done in Alexei's position, whether you would have had the courage to gather evidence against a commander with absolute authority, whether you would have trusted that patience and documentation would eventually matter. The wilderness of Kamchatka continues unchanged by human dramas, its brown bears following ancient patterns of territory and survival, its forests growing indifferent to the rise and fall of military bases and criminal enterprises. But the humans who passed through that wilderness in the summer of 1994 were forever changed by their experiences, carrying forward lessons about courage, corruption, justice, and the unexpected ways that the universe sometimes delivers consequences that human systems cannot or will not provide. The story ends not with vengeance or violence, but with the quiet satisfaction of knowing that truth eventually surfaces, that evidence survives attempts at suppression, and that sometimes a force of nature arrives at exactly the right moment to prevent tragedy and deliver the kind of justice that makes future tragedies less likely. Remember always that power corrupts, that isolation enables abuse, that systems require constant vigilance and courageous individuals willing to risk everything for principles that matter. Remember that true strength comes from protecting others rather than dominating them, from building communities rather than exploiting them, from standing up against injustice even when doing so seems impossibly dangerous. And remember that sometimes, in the vast wilderness of Kamchatka or in the tangled bureaucracies of post-Soviet Russia or in any system anywhere that has lost its way, justice arrives in unexpected forms and delivers consequences that restore balance to a world temporarily tilted toward corruption and cruelty. The frozen ground cracked beneath boots as the young man stumbled backward through the December darkness, his expensive parka torn open at the collar, his breath coming in panicked gasps that crystallized